The market on Tyon Station opened at the same time it always did. 6th hour. Second watch. The vendors pulled back their shutters, arranged their goods, and began the familiar business of ordinary life. The same life they had lived yesterday. The same life they expected to live tomorrow. Nobody had told them yet. Nobody knew there was anything to tell. Here is what you need to understand before this story goes any further. Two people are about to make one decision. It will take less than 30 seconds. It will feel like nothing, like a small, practical choice made under pressure. The kind of choice that people like them make every week just to survive. That decision will start a war, not a border skirmish, not a political dispute. A war that will burn worlds, a war that will collapse a civilization that has existed for thousands of years. A war that will open a wound in the Force so deep that Jedi scholars, centuries later, will still argue about whether it ever fully closed. Two people, one decision, 30 seconds, and the ordinary market on Tyon Station, open at the 6th hour as always, completely unaware that the people about to end the world are docked 3 berths down, arguing about money. The Starbreaker 12 was not a beautiful ship. It had never been a beautiful ship. It had been, at various points in its operational history, a serviceable ship, a barely functional ship, and on 3 memorable occasions, a ship that was technically flying but probably shouldn't have been. On this particular morning, the 14th of Concordia, by the Republic Customs stamp on their docking permit, it was somewhere between serviceable and concerning. The cargo hold contained textile goods from an outer rim supplier. The textiles were fine. The problem was that fine textiles, on this route, at current rates, did not cover the docking fee at Tyon Station, the fuel cost for the next leg, the overdue maintenance invoice from the last port, and the 3 separate debt notices that had been waiting in their message queue since before they left Nar Shaddaa. Jory had run the numbers 4 times. The numbers did not improve with repetition. She was 26 years old, and she had the eyes of someone older. Not old, just experienced in the specific way that people become experienced when they have been managing a failing enterprise for long enough that failure starts to feel like a natural condition. She sat at the cargo manifest terminal in the Starbreaker 12's small operations bay, stylus in hand, going through the line items with the focused attention of someone looking for a number that isn't there. The numbers were 847 credits incoming from the textile delivery. The numbers were also 1,200 credits owed. The gap between those 2 numbers was not new. The gap between those 2 numbers had been the defining feature of their life for the past 2 years. She set the stylus down. She picked it up again. She put a line through the maintenance invoice, not paid, just deferred, again, and moved the fuel cost to the top of the priority column. Without fuel, they couldn't move. Without moving, they couldn't work. Without working, the gap between 847 and 1,100 became permanent. She had learned to think in these chains. If this, then this, then this, then ruin. It kept her very busy. It kept her from thinking about other things. Gav was in the navigation bay, which was generous language for a closet with a chair and a screen. He was 24, 2 years younger than Jory, and he still had the quality of someone who believed things were going to get better. She did not know how he maintained this. She suspected it was a biological trait she had not inherited. The screen in front of him displayed a sector map, an old one, predating the Republic's last formal survey of the Outer Rim. He had pulled it from a data archive in their last port, paying 3 credits for access, which Jory had noted in the expenditure column without comment. She had many things she did not comment on. Gav's archive fees were among the smaller ones. He had his finger on a faint dotted line near the edge of the mapped region, the kind of line that meant unconfirmed route, no current data, navigate at own discretion. He was smiling at it. This was typical. Jory. She didn't look up from the terminal. We're down 350 credits before the delivery fee clears, she said. Whatever you're about to say, price it first. A pause. What if I told you I found a hyperspace lane that no licensed navigator has touched in 40 years? I'd say it hasn't been touched in 40 years. For a reason. What if the reason is just that everyone assumes it's dangerous, but nobody's actually verified that? She looked up. He was still smiling. Gav, I'm just saying, the survey data on this sector is ancient. The Tyon cluster's eastern approach has 3 uncharted corridors that run toward what? A slight pause, toward unmapped space. She looked at him for a moment. Then she looked back at the terminal. No, she said. He didn't push it. That was the thing about Gav, he never pushed immediately. He would mention something. Let it sit. Mention it again later, when she'd had time to think about it and arrived, on her own, at the place where the question started to seem reasonable. It was an effective technique. She was fully aware it was an effective technique. She applied it back to him when necessary. They were, in most respects, very good at managing each other. The debt collector came at the start of third watch. This was the 3rd visit in 2 standard weeks. He was a Twi'lek male, professionally polite, carrying a datapad with their account summary itemized in columns that left no room for interpretation. He stood at the Starbreaker 12's boarding ramp. Jory stood at the top of it. They had a conversation that had the structure of a conversation and the content of a wall. He explained the outstanding balance. She explained their current delivery situation. He explained the interest accruing on the outstanding balance. She explained the timeline for their next confirmed cargo run. He explained that the timeline was insufficient. She explained that it was the timeline they had. He noted the account and left. She watched him walk down the docking bay corridor toward the next ship on his list. 3 berths down, a vessel she hadn't paid much attention to was receiving its own docking inspection. It was a strange-looking ship. The hull markings were in an alphabet she didn't recognize. Old, geometric, the letters carved rather than printed. The customs manifest on the docking office board listed its registration date in a calendar notation she had never seen before. The station official handling the inspection didn't seem bothered by this. Foreign vessels came through Tyon Station regularly. The Starbreaker 12 was foreign enough herself, to some ports. Jory noted the ship without interest and went back inside. Later, she would try to remember that vessel. She would not be able to reconstruct it clearly. It was a ship at a docking berth. It was nothing. Tyon Station was busy during the afternoon cycle. The market district ran along the station's inner ring, 2 corridors wide, low ceilings, the kind of permanent temporary architecture that accumulates in places where commerce has been happening for long enough that nobody can remember a time when it wasn't. Jory walked it to clear her head. She did this when the numbers stopped moving in useful directions. Walking did not fix the numbers. but it gave her something to look at that was not the numbers. The vendors were mostly human, with a scattering of other species common to the Tyon cluster region. A Suliston selling navigation components, a pair of Duros with a cart of hydroponics equipment, a human woman with white hair and the deep-creased face of permanent sun exposure, selling dried food items from an off-world supplier, arranged in careful rows on a cloth-covered table. The woman adjusted one of the packages as Jory passed. It had been in the correct position already. She adjusted it anyway, a small, habitual act of maintenance, of keeping her small portion of the world arranged correctly. Jory stopped. She bought a package of the dried food items. She did not need them. She had enough food on the ship. She bought them anyway, and put them in her jacket pocket, and walked on. The station's public notice board near the docking registry carried the week's commercial listings. She checked them without much hope. There were 3 cargo opportunities in the cluster. One paid well and required a Class II commercial license they didn't have. One paid adequately and was going to a destination that would take them further from any profitable route. One paid almost nothing and was going in the right direction. She noted the third one. She kept moving. When she got back to the ship, Gav had tea ready. This was one of his consistent qualities. Whatever else was happening, he managed to have something hot available when she came back from walking. She had never asked him to do this. He had simply done it, for as long as she could remember, without announcement. She sat down across from him at the small table in the galley. He put a cup in front of her. She put her hands around it. The ship was quiet around them, the ambient hum of the docking bay, the distant sounds of the station, the faint ticking of the hull adjusting to temperature. "There's a run to the Koros system," she said. "It pays badly." "Koros," Gav said. "That's 3 days out, 2.5 if the Tion-Koros lane is clear. It's been congested. I checked this morning." She drank the tea. "Then 3 days," she said. He was quiet for a moment. She knew what he was thinking about. She was thinking about it too, now. That was the thing about his technique. "The Eastern Tion Corridor," he said. "Gav, I've been looking at the survey data for 6 hours. He turned the screen toward her. The old map was still up. The faint dotted line near the edge. "There's a gap in the mapped lanes here that nobody's charted since the Kamat Kroti expedition. And that was ancient. 43 years ago. Navigation technology was different. They may have missed something, or they may have found something and correctly identified it as a route that ends badly. There are no hazard markers on record, because there's no record. That's the problem." He looked at her. She looked at the map. The dotted line was not dramatic. It was faint, labeled unconfirmed, and it pointed toward a section of the map where the cartographers had simply stopped drawing because they didn't have data to work with. "If it's a clean lane," Gav said, "we could be the first licensed operators on record. That's worth something. That's negotiating power. If it's not clean, we're dead. We're not going to be dead. You don't know that." "You have hope," she said. "That's different from knowing." He didn't argue with that. He knew better. But he left the map on the screen. The second debt notice had come in the morning. She had routed it to the deferred column without opening it. She opened it now, while Gav refilled the tea. The numbers in it were not new. They were the same numbers, presented in slightly different language, with an updated interest calculation at the bottom. She read the interest calculation. She read it again. She put the notice back in the deferred column. 350 credits short, she said. I know. The Koros run gets us 200, if we're lucky with the exchange rate. I know. That leaves us 150 down, with the maintenance invoice still sitting there, and the next cycle's docking registration due in 18 days. I know, Jory. The tea was ready. He set it down. He didn't look at her. He looked at the map. She looked at the tea. The ship made its small sounds around them. Tyon Station's docking bay lights shifted to the amber cycle at the start of night watch. The market on the inner ring began closing down. The vendor with the white hair folded her cloth, packed her remaining goods with the careful precision of someone who had done this 10,000 times, and locked the case with a key that she wore on a cord around her neck. The Suliston selling navigation components covered his display table. The station's ambient noise dropped from the daytime level to the quieter register of night operations. Fewer people moving, more space between sounds. 3 berths down, the strange vessel with the geometric hull markings was still docked. Its running lights were a color Jory didn't have a word for. Not red, not quite purple, something between. I'll think about it, she said. Gav looked up. She was looking at the map. The Eastern Corridor, she said. I'll think about it. He didn't say anything. He understood that I'll think about it was not yes. He also understood that I'll think about it was not no, which was more than he'd had an hour ago. She filed the Koros run application at the start of night watch, the backup, the safe choice, the one that barely covered costs. Then she pulled up the uncharted corridor survey data and read it for 40 minutes. 43 years old. No hazard markers, no successful transit record, no unsuccessful transit record either. Just the edge of the map, and beyond it, the notation that the cartographers had used when they simply ran out of information. Beyond this point, unconfirmed. She closed the file. She opened the route application for the Tyon Eastern Corridor. The form was short. It had one notable field in bold text which read, Uncharted Corridor, proceed at own risk. No Republic navigation guarantee. No emergency services access. Operator assumes full liability. She read that field twice. She filled in the ship registration. She filled in the operator license. She moved the cursor to the confirmation button. She held it there for a moment. The Starbreaker 12 made its small sounds. Somewhere in the docking bay, something shifted, a mechanical adjustment, routine and forgettable. In the nav bay, the port-side sensor cluster ran its overnight diagnostic and returned a reading that was 2% off baseline. Neither of them noticed. Neither of them would notice for a long time. She pressed confirm. The screen read, route application received. Uncharted corridor, proceed at own risk. She closed the terminal. She went to her bunk. She did not sleep for a while. In the morning, the Starbreaker 12's pre-flight sequence completed without issues. Gav ran the nav check. Jory ran the systems check. They moved through the routine with the efficiency of people who have performed it so many times that it requires no communication. Each step known, each handoff understood, each confirmation given without looking up from the relevant panel. The docking bay doors opened on the station's outer wall. Deep space sat beyond them, dark and full and vast in the specific way that it is only visible from a docking bay door. Framed, contained, comprehensible for one moment before you fly into it. The Starbreaker 12's running lights came on automatically. Their reflection appeared in the station's exterior viewport, small, steady, orange-white against the dark. "Ready?" Gav said. "Ready," she said. She meant it the way she always meant it, as a practical statement, as a confirmation that the systems were go, and the course was plotted, and the choice had been made. Not as a claim about what was waiting at the other end of the corridor. She was never ready for that. Nobody ever is. The Starbreaker 12 lifted off the docking bay floor, oriented toward open space, and flew into the dark. 3 berths behind it, the strange vessel with the geometric hull markings sat motionless. Its running lights, that color without a name, did not flicker. The market on Tyon Station's inner ring opened at the 6th hour. Second watch. The same time it always did. The hyperspace tunnel ended without warning. One moment, blue-white corridor, the familiar non-sound of faster-than-light travel, the feeling of being nowhere between 2 somewheres. The next moment, real space. Stars. A massive orange sun, low and swollen on the port side. A planet below, dark-banded, storm-wrapped, enormous. Jory had the nav console up before the transition fully completed. The coordinates on the screen did not match the coordinates she had filed. She checked them again. They still did not match. Gav. He was already at the secondary panel, fingers moving fast. "I see it," he said. "Where are we?" A pause that lasted 3 seconds longer than she wanted it to. "Primus Golud system," he said. "Or close to it." The lane drifted. "There's a gravitational variance in the corridor that the old survey didn't account for. We came out," another pause. "We came out wrong." Jory looked at the planet. She looked at the sun. She looked at the space between the Starbreaker 12 and the nearest edge of the system. And then the sensors picked up the other ships. There were 4 of them. They were already moving. Not the slow reorientation of vessels that had noticed something unexpected. These ships moved with the practiced economy of a patrol that had been waiting. Not for the Starbreaker 12 specifically, but for anything that came through that particular gap in space. They were unlike any vessel configuration in Jory's recognition library. Organic-looking, almost, the way a shell is organic, or a carapace. Curved where Republic warships were angular, dark-hulled, with running light configurations she didn't recognize. No transponder signal. No hailing frequency she could identify. "Gav, I'm trying to raise them. Try faster." The 4 ships closed the distance between their position and the Starbreaker 12 in the time it took Jory to calculate 2 potential escape vectors and rule out both of them. The first, blocked by the patrol formation. The second, blocked by the planet's gravity well. A third option existed, back into the hyperspace lane they had just exited. But the Starbreaker 12's drive needed 4 minutes to recycle for another jump. They did not have 4 minutes. They had, by her estimate, about 90 seconds. She used 60 of them trying anyway. The resonance arrived before the ships did. That was the only word for it. Not a sound. The Starbreaker 12's hull was sealed. Space carried nothing. But something. A pressure that began at the base of the skull and moved forward, settling behind the eyes like the early warning of a headache that never fully arrived. Jory pressed 2 fingers to her temple without thinking. Gav had gone still at his console. "Do you feel that?" he said. She didn't answer. She was back at the controls, running the recycling sequence, watching the drive counter move with the slowness of something that did not care about urgency. The resonance built, not painful, not quite, just present, insistent, like a tone played on a frequency slightly below hearing, felt in the chest rather than understood by the ear. The 4 vessels came alongside. One of them was much larger than the others. It settled into position off the port bow with the unhurried confidence of something that knew it didn't need to rush. A docking clamp extended. It connected to the Starbreaker 12's hull with a sound that traveled through the metal, into the deck plates, into the soles of Jory's boots. She felt it in her feet before she heard it. The drive counter read 3 minutes, 40 seconds. She shut the sequence down. There was no point. They came through the docking port in pairs. Soldiers, armored in something that was not quite Republic plastoid, and not quite anything she had a name for. The armor was dark red. The helmets were full face, with narrow optical slots. They moved efficiently and without speech. Jory stood at the top of the boarding ramp with her hands visible and her face arranged to express nothing in particular. This was a skill she had developed over years of dealing with port authorities, customs officials, and debt collectors. It served her now. One of the soldiers directed her toward the port. Another directed Gav toward the starboard side of the docking connection, toward a different exit, a different vessel. She understood immediately what was happening. Gav. He looked at her. The soldier between them did not allow the moment to extend. She was moved left. He was moved right. The last thing she saw, before the docking port sealed behind her, was his face. Not frightened, exactly. Something between frightened and determined, which was an expression she recognized because she had seen it on him their entire lives. Then the port closed, and the Starbreaker 12 was behind her, and she was somewhere she had never been, with people she could not communicate with, heading toward a destination she could not predict. She began counting exits. The cell they put her in was not cruel. That was the first thing she noted. Clean surfaces. A sleeping platform. A water source she tested carefully before using. Temperature controlled to something approximating comfort. She sat on the sleeping platform and worked through what she knew. She knew they were in unmapped space, past the edge of the Tion cluster's surveyed region. She knew the vessels that had intercepted them were military, organized, and had been patrolling that specific area. She knew the patrol had not destroyed them on contact. That was significant. People who intend to kill you do not spend resources on a cell with climate control. People who intend to use you, or study you, or determine what you are, those people provide a sleeping platform. She was, for the moment, potentially useful. She intended to remain potentially useful for as long as it took to find Gav and get back to the Starbreaker 12. She lay back on the platform. She stared at the ceiling. She did not allow herself to think about what would happen if she couldn't find him. That was a version of the future she wasn't ready to calculate yet. Gav's cell was on a different vessel, and a guard came for him within the hour. He was brought through corridors that told him things, if he paid attention. He paid attention. The ship was large. Military, clearly. The layout had the organized purposefulness of a vessel designed to move troops and sustain extended operations. The architecture was unlike anything he'd encountered. The Republic built ships in straight lines, functional and undecorated. These corridors curved slightly, the walls carrying low-relief designs that were not purely decorative, symbols, repeated in patterns that suggested meaning rather than ornament. Language, maybe, or something older than language. He filed this without having anywhere useful to file it. The guard stopped at a door. The door opened. The room beyond was not large. A single light source, positioned above a table. A chair on one side of the table, empty. A figure on the other side, standing. The figure was human, or human enough that the distinction did not matter at first glance. Tall, dark-robed, perhaps 40 years old in appearance, though something about the way he held himself suggested that appearance was not a reliable measure. He looked at Gav with the specific quality of attention that Gav had experienced only once before, from a recruiter for a mid-rim shipping consortium who had looked at him and said, in a flat voice, "I need to determine whether you are worth what this will cost me." That recruiter had decided yes. Gav had not taken the position. Too far from Jory, too long a contract. He thought about that now. Briefly, the figure gestured at the empty chair. Gav sat. The man did not speak immediately. He set a datapad on the table. On it, the survey charts from the Starbreaker 12's navigation bay. The old ones. The ones Gav had been studying for 6 hours on the station. The faint dotted line. The unmapped region. Gav looked at them, and then looked at the man. The man looked at the charts for a long moment. Then he looked at Gav. His expression did not tell Gav anything specific. It told him that a calculation was being performed, that the answer to the calculation had not yet been determined. That Gav himself was one of the variables. The man said something in a language Gav did not know. The cadence of it was old, deeply old, the way some planetary dialects carry age in their vowels, the compression of centuries into the shape of a word. A translator appeared from somewhere off to the side, small, rodent-featured, with the nervous manner of someone whose survival depends on accuracy. "He asks," the translator said, "where you were going." Gav looked at the charts. He looked at the man. "We were lost," he said. The translator conveyed this. The man's expression did not change. He asked another question. "He asks," the translator said, "how far the lane runs." Gav understood, in that moment, the exact nature of what was happening. The man was not asking about the Starbreaker 12. He was not asking about Gav. He was asking about what was on the other side of the dotted line. He was asking about the Republic. Gav kept his face still. "I don't know," he said. "We were lost. I told you." The man looked at him for a long time after the translation. He did not seem convinced. He did not seem unconvinced either. He seemed to be filing Gav the same way Gav had been filing the corridor architecture, in a category labeled potentially useful, determination pending. The name came later, from the translator, when Gav asked it directly. The translator seemed surprised he had asked, then seemed to decide there was no harm in answering. The name was 2 syllables. The first sounded like a pressure drop, the second like something closing. Naga Sado. Gav repeated it quietly to himself, in his cell, afterward, not to memorize it, but to make it real. A name made a person. A person could be read. A person had motivations that could be understood and possibly navigated. He held that thought. He needed something to hold. In her cell, on her ship, Jory had reached a conclusion. The conclusion was they were alive. Both of them. She was certain of this, in the way that she was certain of things she had no evidence for but had never been wrong about. He was alive. She was alive. Everything else was a problem to be addressed in sequence. She was good at sequences. She had been managing sequences their entire adult life. This one was more dangerous than most. It was still a sequence. She sat up on the sleeping platform and looked at the cell door and began identifying methodically the things she could control and the things she could not. The list of things she could not control was long. She set it aside. The list of things she could control was short. She started there. Somewhere on the larger vessel, a door closed. Naga Sato sat alone at the table after the young human was returned to his cell. He looked at the charts for a long time. The dotted line. Unconfirmed. Beyond this point, unconfirmed. He picked up the survey data and read it with the careful thoroughness of someone who understood that what appeared to be a small thing could be the edge of something much larger. He had known, for some time, that the Republic lay beyond his empire's mapped borders. He had not known where the opening was. He knew now. He set the charts down. He looked at the wall for a moment with the expression of someone who has just found the answer to a question and is now quietly calculating what the answer means. Then he opened the sealed storage compartment built into the table's underside. He placed the charts inside. He closed the compartment. The lock engaged with a sound that was small and precise and final. In the silence of the room, it seemed to carry further than it should. He sat with his hands flat on the table. He did not move for a long time. Outside the viewports, the stars of his empire's border, his empire's former border, turned slowly in the dark. They had no idea what had just changed. Neither did the Republic. Neither did the two young humans in their separate cells, each quietly deciding to stay alive for the sake of the other, each believing the distance between them was temporary. It was not temporary, but they did not know that yet. This chapter does not take place in a cell. It takes place 3 years earlier, on a cargo run that went well. That matters, because the version of Jory Daragon that most people never got to see, the one that existed before the debt notices, and the deferred maintenance, and the narrowing corridor of bad options, that version showed up most clearly on the days when things went right. And things did go right, once, not for long, but long enough that she had built something real from it, long enough that losing it meant something specific. The Starbreaker 12 had not always been a liability. 3 years before the Tion route, before Primus Galud, before any of what came after, the ship was running a legitimate contract with a trade house called Rego Mercantile, a mid-sized Republic commercial operator with routes through the colonies and select Outer Rim corridor. The contract had come through a port contact in the Koros system. Jory had spent 2 weeks negotiating the terms. She had read every clause. She had pushed back on the liability provisions in Section 4, rewritten the delivery window language in Section 7, and inserted a fuel cost adjustment clause that the Rego representative initially refused and then, after she explained the math quietly and without pressure, accepted. She was 23 years old. The representative was twice her age and had spent his career in commercial freight law. He signed her version of the contract. She did not celebrate this in front of him. She walked back to the Starbreaker 12, sat down in the operations bay, and allowed herself 30 seconds of something that felt, briefly, like solid ground. Then she filed the contract. opened the delivery schedule, and started planning the first run. The Rego contract paid 1,400 credits per completed delivery. It covered fuel. It covered basic maintenance at approved service stations. It included a performance bonus structure that, if met consistently, would have cleared their outstanding debt in 14 months. 14 months. She had done the projection 6 times, every time 14 months. After that, not wealth, not comfort in any expansive sense, but a position. A cleared account. A ship that was not one bad run from impoundment. The beginning of something that could be built on. Gav had been cautiously optimistic about the contract. Cautiously was her word. His version had involved more enthusiasm and a very specific excitement about one of the Rego routes, which passed through a system near the edge of the colonies that he had been wanting to survey for navigation anomalies since he was 19. She had let him be enthusiastic. She had been, quietly, enthusiastic herself. They were good at their work. She had always known this. The Rego contract was the first time someone else had confirmed it in writing. The third run under the contract took them through a system called Honaker, a mid-route waypoint, unremarkable, the kind of stop that exists to break a long transit into manageable segments. The Starbreaker 12 dropped into the system at the start of 4th Watch, on a day the Republic calendar recorded as the 8th of Vigilis, the Watchman's Month, as it happened, though she had not thought about that until much later. The system's check on arrival returned normal readings across the board. Except one. The portside sensor cluster, already carrying its low-grade calibration fault, registered an anomaly at the edge of the system's sensor range. Not a ship, not a hazard marker. Something else. A density variance in the local space fabric. The kind of reading that sometimes indicated a gravitational fluctuation, sometimes indicated instrument drift, and occasionally indicated something the sensor was not calibrated to identify precisely. Jory looked at it for 45 seconds. She ran a secondary confirmation sweep. The secondary sweep returned a milder version of the same reading, consistent with instrument error, given the portside cluster's known calibration issue. She logged it as instrument drift. She marked the sensor for maintenance at the next service stop. She moved on. It was not instrument drift. She would not know this for 3 years. What the portside sensor had detected at the edge of its range was a gravitational signature consistent with a hyperspace lane terminus. The point where a corridor through faster-than-light space connects with real space, an uncharted terminus. The edge of a lane that ran in a direction no Republic navigator had formally surveyed, toward a system that no Republic cartographer had named. The Starbreaker 12 had been 3 light hours from the opening of the Sith corridor. Jory had looked at it for 45 seconds. She had logged it as instrument error. She had moved on. The war had been 3 light hours away, and she had filed it under maintenance and continued her route. This is the kind of thing that cannot be changed after the fact. It can only be carried. The Rego contract lasted 11 months, not 14, 3 months short of the debt clearance projection. It ended because Rego Mercantile's Eastern Colonies division closed, not because of anything the Starbreaker 12 had done, not because of any performance failure on Jory's part, but because a larger shipping consortium absorbed Rego's parent company and restructured its route operations, eliminating the contract tier that the Starbreaker 12 had been operating under. The notice arrived on the 3rd of Lux, the Republic's month of light, its longest day. It was not a good day for the irony. The notice was polite. It included a partial severance payment that covered 2 months of projected earnings. It did not cover the outstanding debt that the contract had been scheduled to clear. It did not cover the maintenance work that had been deferred on the assumption that the contract income would continue. It did not cover the 3 months between what they had and what they had been planning to have. Jory read the notice once. She filed it. She opened the accounts projection and ran the numbers again. The solid ground was gone. What she did not do, she did not blame Rego Mercantile. The company had honored its contract terms. The restructuring was not aimed at her. Nobody had decided to harm Jory Daragon specifically. She understood this. It did not make the numbers better. It made them, in a specific way, worse, because there was nothing to push back against, nothing to negotiate, no clause she had missed that could be revised. The ground had simply been removed. No malice, no error. Just the ordinary cruelty of a universe that does not organize its misfortunes around anyone's personal timeline. The year after the Rego contract became a kind of sustained improvisation. Shorter runs, varying rates, the accumulation of small jobs that kept them moving but never moved them forward. The debt notices resumed. The maintenance deferrals resumed. The gap between incoming and outgoing, the gap she had almost closed, reopened and slowly widened. Gav handled this differently than she did. She became quieter, more precise in her movements, her language, her calculations. She stripped away everything that wasn't directly useful. He found things to be interested in. Survey charts, navigation anomalies, the kind of speculative cartography that she could not afford and he could not stop. She had, on occasion, said something sharp about the archive fees. She had, more occasions than she wanted to count, not said anything, because he was using interest in the unknown as a way of staying functional while their circumstances contracted around them. And she understood that even when she couldn't afford to support it. They had never discussed this. Some things between people who depend on each other are understood without discussion. The understanding is part of the dependency. The Tyon Station arrival, the one from Chapter 1, the one with the debt collector and the third notice and the decision that changed everything, sits in the commercial records with a date and a delivery notation, and a cargo manifest. 847 credits incoming, 1,200 credits owed. The gap, 353 credits. 3 years of work since the Rego contract ended. 3 years of competence and endurance and accurate calculation, and making good decisions under pressure. The gap, 353 credits. She had not made bad decisions. She had made the decisions available to her, with the information available to her, at the margins available to her. The margins had simply been too thin. This is what she had not yet fully understood, sitting at the terminal in Tyon Station, running the numbers for the 4th time. You can be right about everything and still end up at 353 credits short. She would understand it later. After. Understanding it would not make it easier. Now she was in a cell on a Sith warship. The cell was clean. The water worked. The temperature was controlled. She had been sitting on the sleeping platform for what felt like 4 hours. She had counted the exits. 1 door, sealed, no visible mechanism on her side, and assessed the walls, the ceiling, the floor, and the water source. She had found nothing useful. She had started again from the beginning. She had still found nothing useful. So she did the thing she did when the numbers stopped moving. She thought about Gav. Not where he was. She had placed that in the category of things she could not currently control. She thought about who he was. The way he made tea without announcing it. The way he smiled at dotted lines on old maps. The way he had looked at her when the soldier moved him right and her left. With that expression she had seen their entire lives. Not frightened. Not only frightened. Determined. Moving in the direction of the right choice. Even when the right choice was hard. She thought, he needs to know which direction to move. She did not know if the cell had a communication signal. She did not know if a message sent from here would reach anything. She checked anyway. The signal was faint, a carrier wave, not a standard channel, the kind of low frequency bleed through that older communication systems produced as a byproduct of operation. Not designed for transmission. Not impossible for transmission either. She was good at working with not impossible. She pulled the cell's emergency signal panel, present in the cell. She had noted it in her first sweep, filed it as potential, and bypassed the emergency function to access the carrier frequency directly. This took her 40 minutes and the wire from the platform's fastening bracket. She composed the message in the operational shorthand she and Gav had developed over years of working together, compressed, specific, not readable to anyone who didn't know their system. It said, alive. Move toward the secondary corridor. Follow the lane drift. I'll come from that direction. She did not know if the lane drift was the right instruction. She did not know if he was in a position to move anywhere. She sent it anyway, because it was the direction she was pointing him. Because pointing him somewhere, even into uncertainty, was better than pointing him at nothing. The carrier frequency absorbed the signal. Whether it went anywhere, whether it reached any receiver, passed through any wall, traveled across the gap between two ships where her brother was sitting in his own cell, making his own calculations, she could not confirm. She set the wire down. She lay back on the platform. The cell was quiet. Somewhere beyond its walls, in the dark space outside a system whose star she had not yet seen clearly, a message was traveling, or it wasn't. She had sent it. That was the thing she could control. She had done it. 3 years of careful work. 11 months of a contract that almost changed everything. 1 45-second look at a sensor reading she had labeled instrument error and filed under maintenance. 1 route application filed at night watch on Tyon Station. Cursor held over the confirmation button for a moment that felt like a decision, and was in fact the last moment before the decision made itself. These are the components. This is what she carried into Sith space. Not recklessness, not ignorance. A life of competence and endurance, lived at margins too thin to absorb one more degree of ordinary bad luck, and the specific, devastating trust she had placed in her own judgment, which had never failed her before, and would not fail her now exactly, but would carry her somewhere her judgment had not been designed to navigate. The version of Jory Daragon that believed careful calculation was protection. That version was in the cell. The version that would exist after was being made in the dark, slowly, without her consent. She did not know this yet. She was still counting exits. The message floated outward from the carrier frequency. Faint, compressed, addressed to a receiver it might never find. Alive. Move toward the secondary corridor. Follow the lane drift. I'll come from that direction. On the other side of whatever distance separated them, Gav Daragon was in his own cell. He had just returned from a room where a man named Naga Sado had looked at him with the careful attention of someone performing a calculation. He did not know a message was coming. He did not know she had found a way to send one. He was sitting on a platform very similar to hers, in a cell with the same temperature and the same clean surfaces. working through the same inventory of things he could and could not control. He had not yet received the message, but the direction it pointed him was the direction he was already facing. That was not coincidence. That was simply who they were. The freedom came on the fourth day. Not full freedom. Gav understood immediately that full freedom was not on the table, and probably never would be. But the cell door opened at the start of what the station's rhythm suggested was morning, and the guard who appeared did not bring restraints. He brought a meal, and then he stepped aside. The corridor beyond the door was empty. Gav stood at the threshold for a moment. The guard watched him with the neutral expression of someone who had been told, "Let him move and note where he goes." Gav stepped out. The station was not what he had expected. He had expected a military installation, functional, stripped, organized around the single purpose of holding things and launching things. What he found was older than that. The corridors he moved through had clearly been built before anyone thought about war. The ceiling vaulted in a way that served no structural function he could identify. It was simply high, in the manner of spaces designed to remind the people inside them that they were small relative to something larger. The walls carried those symbols again. Up close, they were more intricate than he had noticed during his initial transit. Not decorative. He was increasingly certain they were not decorative. They had the quality of inscription, language committed to a permanent surface. The way important things get written into stone rather than screen, because stone does not lose power when the system goes down. He ran his fingers along one sequence. The guard did not stop him. He kept walking. Sado met with him in a different room this time. Larger, more light. A long table with documents spread across it. Physical documents, actual material, not data pads. And this alone told Gav something about the Sith relationship to permanence. The translator was present. Sado was already seated. He gestured at the chair across from him without looking up from what he was reading. Gav sat. He waited. He had learned how Sado began conversations, by making the other person wait long enough to feel the asymmetry, then beginning from a position that rendered the asymmetry unremarkable. It was effective. Gav recognized it and sat in it anyway, because there was no alternative. Sado spoke. The translator rendered it as, "You have been walking the corridors." "Yes," Gav said. "What have you seen?" Gav considered the honest answer. "An old place," he said. "Older than anything I've been in before." Sado looked at him for the first time since he had entered. Something in the look was not warm, exactly, attentive. The quality of someone who has been waiting to see whether a particular response would arrive. And it has, and this is noted. The station was built before the current era, the translator conveyed. Before the wars that shaped this empire. Before the names that history uses. What you are standing in was built by people who understood the Force differently than any civilization you have encountered. Gav said nothing. He was listening. What followed was 2 hours of the most genuinely interesting conversation Gav Daragon had ever had. He knew this was a problem. He knew that interesting conversations with people who are holding you captive are not accidents. He knew that what he was being shown was being chosen for him, arranged for maximum effect by someone who had calculated exactly what a young Republic human with a weakness for the edges of maps would find compelling. He knew all of this. He listened anyway, because some of what Sado said was simply true. The Sith civilization was old, not old in the way that Republic institutions described themselves as old. The performative age of bureaucracies that needed tradition as justification. Old in the way that languages get old, and burial practices get old, and the names people give to stars get old. The Sith people, not the dark side order, not the military empire, but the actual culture, the civilization that had existed on Ziost and Korriban, and a dozen other worlds before any Republic senator had been born, had been studying the Force for longer than the Republic had existed. Their understanding of it was different. Not wrong, necessarily. Different. Sado did not describe it as superior. He described it as prior, as the thing that had been there first, before the Jedi Order formalized its own approach, before the Republic built its institutions around one specific interpretation of what the Force was, and what it meant, and who got to use it. Gav thought about the Jedi. He had met Jedi twice in his life, formal, measured people in robes, moving through port authorities with the quiet authority of those who exist within a structure that everyone else defers to. He had not disliked them. He had simply felt in their presence that the conversation was already over before it started, that whatever he might say would be categorized and filed without much surprise. Sado looked at him as if the conversation was not over, as if it had not yet reached the part Sado was actually interested in. This was manipulation. It was also a sensation Gav had not experienced many times. Being looked at as if you might say something worth hearing. The archivist arrived at the start of the afternoon period. She was younger than he expected, perhaps his age, perhaps slightly older, with the specific posture of someone who has spent most of their life in rooms with important things in them, and has developed a formal relationship with space as a result. She carried a portable holocron projector. She set it on the table without ceremony and activated it without introduction. What appeared above the table was a city, or what had been a city. The projection was fragmentary, damaged source material, rendered in the flickering amber gold of old holocron recording. But even fragmentary, even damaged, the scale of it was clear. Korriban. Not the bare tomb world the Republic would later catalogue. Korriban as it had been, a city carved into red stone, terraced and vast, with structures that climbed the cliff faces in layers that must have taken generations to complete. Gav leaned forward. The archivist watched him with professional neutrality. She moved the projection to the next fragment. Interior spaces. Libraries, possibly. Rooms lined with objects that might have been texts, might have been artifacts, might have been both. How old is this? Gav asked. The translator conveyed the question. The archivist spoke. Before the exile, the translator said, before the darkness came from outside and changed what this place was used for. Gav understood, partially, what that meant. The Sith had not always been what they were now. Something had happened, something external. Something had arrived from outside their civilization and reshaped it into a different kind of instrument. He thought about the Starbreaker 12. He thought about how a ship that was built for commerce becomes a struggling freight runner when the margins are bad enough, when the options narrow enough, when the pressure applied from outside exceeds what the structure was designed to hold. He thought, civilizations are not so different from ships. He did not say this. He kept watching the projection. The fragment that stopped him was not the most impressive. It was the smallest. A room, single-occupant sized, carved into rock. A sleeping space, he thought. On the wall beside the sleeping platform, inscribed in those symbols he had been tracing in the corridors, a sequence of lines. Not military language, not ceremonial language. The archivist, without prompting, said something to the translator. A parent's inscription, the translator said, written for a child. The translation is, "You were born in a dark season, and you will find your own light." Gav looked at the inscription for a moment. The archivist closed the projection. She packed the projector with the same unhurried care she had arrived with. She left without ceremony. Sato had not spoken during the archive presentation. He was watching Gav. "There is a great deal," the translator conveyed, "that your republic does not know about what existed before it." Gav said nothing. He was still thinking about the inscription on the wall of a sleeping room that had been empty for thousands of years. "You were born in a dark season, and you will find your own light." He understood that he was being shown this deliberately. He understood that every carefully chosen image was doing work on him. He understood all of this. He was also moved by it. Both things were true. The fragment of Jory's message arrived that evening. It came through a receiver in the station's general communications network. The carrier frequency she had used was low enough that it slipped through the monitoring filters as ambient noise. What reached Gav was not the complete message. It was degraded, 3 words intact, the rest scattered into signal noise that resolved as nothing. The 3 words were direction and come, and a directional notation in their operational shorthand that indicated secondary corridor, lane drift. He did not know what the full message had said. He knew the 3 words. He knew her handwriting in code the way he knew her voice. By its specific economy, the way she stripped language down to only what mattered. Direction. Come. Secondary corridor. She was alive. She was telling him which way to face. He deleted the signal record from the station's general log and sat with the 3 words in a room that was not his and made a decision. Not yet. Not today. But the direction was established. He had somewhere to move toward. The Massassi training ground was visible from a window on the station's upper level. He found it the following morning. He had not been directed there. He had simply followed the corridor to its end and found the window. Below, an open drill space carved from the station's lower deck. The Massassi were running formations. There were perhaps 40 of them visible from his angle. Large, significantly larger than baseline human, with the proportions of people whose physical development had been oriented entirely toward one purpose. They moved in patterns that were not quite military drill, and not quite ritual ceremony, something between. Their movements were synchronized in a way that suggested years, not months, years of conditioning. Not chosen conditioning. Gav had spent enough time watching people work to recognize the difference between someone who has trained hard at something they selected and someone who has been shaped, from early enough that they do not remember choosing, into a form that serves someone else's requirements. The Massassi had not chosen this. He could see it in the way they moved. Precise, effective, without the small individual variations that appear when people are doing something they have made their own. These were people who had been made into something, and the thing they had been made into was a weapon. And the civilization that had produced the inscription on the sleeping room wall, "You were born in a dark season," was the same civilization that had produced this. Both things were true. That was the part Sato had not needed to show him. That was the part Gav found himself standing at the window with, unable to file under any category that made it easier. The dreamer in him, the part that had leaned forward at the archive projections, that had traced the corridor symbols, that had felt, briefly, the pull of a civilization old enough to have answers to questions the Republic had never thought to ask. That part went quiet. Not gone. Quiet. The way something goes quiet when it encounters the cost of the thing it was drawn to. He stood at the window for a long time. Below, the Massassi continued their drill. 40 people who had not chosen this life, moving in perfect synchronized violence, in a station built from the bones of a civilization that had once inscribed prayers on sleeping room walls. The gap between those two facts was not resolvable. He had tried. He had spent 4 days trying, in the way that people try to make a complicated thing into a clean thing, because the complicated version is harder to carry. It was not a clean thing. It was a civilization that contained both the inscription and the drill ground, like most civilizations. Like the Republic, probably, if you knew where to look. But he was here, not there. And the direction Jory had pointed him was back, toward the Republic, toward the side that had not shown him beauty before showing him what the beauty rested on. He turned from the window. He walked back down the corridor. The symbols on the walls passed under his hands as he moved. He did not stop to trace them this time. The recovery fleet arrived 3 days after the eruption. They dropped out of hyperspace at the system's edge, standard protocol for an unknown engagement zone, and the sensor operators ran their first sweep before anyone spoke. The sweep took 4 minutes. Nobody filled those 4 minutes with conversation. The results came back. The senior sensor officer looked at them. She looked at them again. She forwarded them to the commander's station without comment, because there was no comment that covered what the sweep had returned. The commander read the results. He ordered a full stop. The fleet sat at the system's edge for 11 minutes before he gave the order to move inward. Those 11 minutes are not explained in the official record. Everyone who was present understood what they were. Primus Golud's star was gone. Not dimmed. Not destabilized in the way that stellar events destabilize. Not the gradual, measurable process of a star moving through its natural cycle. Gone. The system's center held what remained of a stellar mass after catastrophic induced eruption. A cooling remnant, dense and dark, radiating in wavelengths that the fleet's instruments struggled to categorize. The sensor operator who wrote the initial report used the word scar. She was reprimanded for non-technical language in an official document. The reprimand was filed. Her word survived anyway, because it was the accurate one. What surrounded the remnant was harder to look at than the remnant itself. Debris. The word does not carry what the recovery fleet found. Debris suggests identifiable material, hull plating, equipment, the recognizable components of vessels that had been whole and were now in pieces. Some of what surrounded Primus Golud's remnant was that. Republic hull markings, drive units, the kind of wreckage that has a clear origin and can be catalogued and assigned to a loss record. Some of what surrounded the remnant was not that. Some of it had been a planet, the outpost world that had orbited Primus Golud's star, a small installation, a research and monitoring station established by a Republic science consortium 11 years prior, was present in the debris field as geological material. Rock. Mineral composition consistent with a Class M planetary body. The consortium's records listed the station's population as 43 people at last formal census, conducted 18 months before the battle. The recovery fleet found no survivors. They found no bodies, either. At those temperatures, at that proximity to a stellar eruption, there was nothing left of a body that a standard scan could identify. 43 people. The debris field did not distinguish between the rock of the planet and what had been the people on it. The recovered log from the Republic communication officer covered a period of 6 hours. It began before the battle and ended 40 minutes into the engagement. The officer's name was Aris 10. She was 29 years old. Her rank was Junior Communications Specialist. Her log was recovered from a sealed emergency data capsule that had been ejected from her vessel at some point during the engagement. Standard protocol on Republic warships when primary communication systems detect catastrophic damage risk. The capsule had survived. The vessel had not. The log begins at the start of second watch on a day recorded in the Republic calendar as the 14th of Vigilis. In the Sith records that survived, the same day is listed as the 3rd of Wrath month, year 1349 of the Exile, beginning at the hour of judgment. Aris 10's log does not use either dating system. Her first entry reads, Standard Patrol, Primus Galud Sector. No contacts. Navigator reports the route is clean. Crew is tired. Someone left a food container in the communications bay again. I've noted it 3 times. The mundane quality of this entry is not a contrast to what follows. It is the point. She was doing her job on an ordinary day. Her second entry, 40 minutes later, sensors picking up something I don't have a category for. Not a vessel profile I recognize. Not a natural phenomenon. Something else. Reporting to senior officer now. Third entry. 20 minutes after that, there are a lot of them. More than the sensor sweep initially suggested. The officer is calling for. The entry ends mid-sentence. The capsule was ejected 12 minutes later. What happened in those 12 minutes is not in the log. The debris field contains the answer, distributed across several thousand kilometers of dead space. The Sith meditation sphere was found drifting at the outer edge of the debris field, intact. This was, the recovery team's initial report noted, improbable. The sphere was roughly 15 meters in diameter, dark-hulled, with the organic-looking construction that characterized Sith vessel design. The same curved carapace-like architecture that Jory had observed at Tion Station 3 berths down and filed as foreign, unremarkable. It showed no external damage. Whatever had happened in this system, whatever force had been applied to collapse a star and consume 2 fleets and remove 43 people from the census record, had not touched this sphere. The recovery team secured it with traction cables and brought it alongside their vessel. Nobody wanted to board it. Nobody was ordered to board it. It was sealed, catalogued, and designated for transport to Coruscant under research classification. The team leader's report noted, object appears undamaged. No life signs. Hull temperature consistent with an extended period of unpowered drift. Recommend full analysis under controlled conditions. Do not recommend field investigation. Her recommendation was accepted without debate. Nobody argued for field investigation. The Jedi arrived with the second recovery wave. Her name was Odin Ur's contemporary, a knight, not yet a master, assigned to the fleet's Force-Sensitive Advisory Unit. Her report survives in the Jedi Temple Archive, filed under the classification Unusual Phenomena, Stellar Events, Primus Galud System. The report is 4 paragraphs. 3 of those paragraphs cover standard observations. Fleet status, debris field assessment, recommended protocols for handling recovered Sith materials. The 4th paragraph reads as follows. In its entirety, at the coordinates of the former stellar mass, I perceived an absence in the Force. Not a disturbance in the conventional sense. Not darkness. Not imbalance in the way that concentrated dark side energy produces imbalance. An absence. The place where the star existed is now silent in the Force, in a way that the surrounding space is not. I am uncertain of the correct technical classification for this phenomenon. The closest approximation I can offer is a note removed from a chord. The chord continues. The surrounding notes are present. The missing note is simply gone, not replaced, not transformed, not moved. Gone. I am filing this observation without conclusion because I do not have a conclusion to offer. I recommend that Jedi scholars with expertise in stellar force phenomena review this report. No Jedi scholar review is noted in the archive record. The report sat in its classification folder for decades. The fourth paragraph survived because the Jedi archive did not distinguish between reports that had been acted on and reports that had not. It simply kept them. 6 hours. The recovery fleet's commander ordered the full stop at the inner debris field, and the fleet catalogued for 6 hours. Nobody explained this in the official log. The official log recorded it as a navigational precaution. The debris density requiring careful transit management before the fleet could safely exit the system. The debris density was not, by standard navigation metrics, sufficient to require 6 hours of full stop. The crews knew this. They catalogued anyway. They moved through their tasks in the specific silence of people who are doing something with their hands, because their hands need something to do. The communication channels stayed open. No one spoke above a murmur. When voices appeared, they were task-specific. Mark that section. Sector 7 clear. Moving to the next grid. The murmurs were not whispers. Nobody was trying to be quiet. That was simply the volume that came naturally. That was the register the debris field required. Jory learned what had happened at Primus Golud from a Republic intelligence officer who visited her holding area. She had been moved, by this point, from the initial cell to a room that was technically larger and practically not different. The officer was professional. He presented the information in the measured language of someone who has learned to communicate terrible things without allowing the terrible quality to color his delivery. He told her a star had been collapsed. He told her Republic vessels were among the losses. He told her the working assessment was Sith sorcery, specifically a technique that allowed a force-sensitive practitioner of significant power to accelerate stellar instability. He told her the outpost population had not been evacuated. He said this last item in the same measured register as the others. She sat with it for a moment. 43 people, she said. He confirmed the census figure. She looked at the wall. She thought about the Starbreaker 12. She thought about the portside sensor cluster and the reading she had logged as instrument error, and the 45 seconds she had spent looking at a gravitational signature before filing it under maintenance and moving on. She thought about Gav. She thought, he is still alive. He is still the direction I am moving toward. She held that. She had to hold something. Gav learned what happened at Primus Golud from Naga Sado. This is the important part. Sado told him. He did not hide it. He described the battle in the specific terms of someone reporting a military outcome. Losses sustained. Engagement concluded. Strategic position achieved. He did not describe the outpost population. He described the Republic vessels destroyed and his own forces lost, and the stellar event as a tactical instrument, a tool, something used, not something that had happened to people. Gav listened to the translated account and understood several things simultaneously. First, Sado had just demonstrated what his civilization's power was actually for. Second, the careful archive projections, the inscription on the sleeping room wall, the archivist's formal attention, The 2 hours of genuine conversation, all of it existed inside the same civilization that had pointed a weapon at a star and used it. Third, Sato was telling him this deliberately, not as a confession, as a credential. This is what I can do. This is the instrument you are now adjacent to. Consider your position carefully. Gav considered his position. He thought about Jory. He thought about the direction she had pointed him, in the 3 degraded words that had arrived through a carrier signal. He thought, she is still alive. She is still the direction I am moving toward. He said to the translator, how many survived on our side? The translator conveyed the question. Sato looked at him. He answered. The translator said, the Dark Lord says, the ones worth keeping. Gav kept his face still. He was getting better at keeping his face still. The Sith meditation sphere was loaded onto the research transport at the end of the 6th cataloging hour. The traction cables held it steady as it was moved into the secure cargo section. The research transport's crew had been told not to approach it without authorization. None of them needed to be told twice. Once the sphere was secured and the cargo section sealed, the transport's pilot reported that the loading was complete. The commander ordered the fleet to prepare for departure. One by one, the recovery vessels oriented toward their jump coordinates. The debris field remained. It would remain for a long time. The stellar remnant at its center would cool over centuries into something dense and dark and permanently quiet. The recovery fleet left it there. There was nothing else to do with it. Inside the secured cargo section of the research transport, the Sith meditation sphere sat in the dark, unpowered, drifting, now with the motion of the vessel rather than on its own. But not silent, not entirely. Faint, well below the threshold of audible sound, detectable only by the most sensitive instruments in the research transport's monitoring system, which had been set to maximum sensitivity specifically to watch for any activity. The monitoring system logged it as low-frequency resonance, source undetermined, consistent with residual energy discharge from unknown power source. The technician reviewing the log flagged it for further analysis. The further analysis was scheduled for arrival at Coruscant. The transport entered hyperspace. The resonance continued. Quiet, patient, present in the way that things that have absorbed a great deal of darkness are present. Not aggressive, not threatening in any immediate sense, just there. As if something inside the sphere was not entirely finished. As if the battle that had collapsed a star and erased 43 people from the census record had left something behind inside this curved dark hull. Some residue of what had been directed through it, and that residue was settling slowly, the way disturbed water settles, the way smoke settles after a fire has been put out. Slowly, in the dark, on its way to Coruscant. 3 days after the recovery fleet departed, the debris field at Primus Golud was empty of human presence for the first time since the battle. The remnant of the star occupied the center of the system. Around it, in slowly shifting orbital patterns determined by residual gravitational dynamics, the material of 2 fleets and 1 planet and 43 people moved through the silence. No one was there to observe it. Both sides' records had moved on to the next engagement, the next calculation, the next strategic position. The debris field was not in either calendar. It was simply there, cooling, settling, permanent in the way that things become permanent when there is no one left to change them. The missing note in the chord, gone, as the Jedi had written. Not replaced, not transformed, not moved, Gone. There is a date that appears in both calendars. The Republic Standard records it as the 7th of Memoria, the month historically set aside for maintaining monuments to the war dead, for reviewing loss records, for the administrative work of grief that civilizations perform when they need to believe they have properly accounted for what they lost. The Sith calendar, in the fragments that survived, marks the same rotation as the 19th of Massassi Tide, the month named for the warrior caste, associated with ground operations, with close-range engagement, with the kind of work that does not appear cleanly in strategic summaries or official victory announcements made from safe rooms far from the front lines. Both calendars carry this date. Neither calendar carries what happened on it. This chapter carries it instead. This is what is known. There was a planet in the colony's region. Its name is not used here because using it would suggest that the name still means something clean, and it does not. And the people who lived there deserve more than a location permanently attached to what was done to them. It was an ordinary colony's world, the kind that accumulates across centuries of Republic expansion without becoming notable for anything particular. Not a strategic position, not a cultural center, not a world that appeared in Senate debates unless an infrastructure bill required a list of mid-tier agricultural producers to justify a funding request. It produced grain. It produced manufactured components. It paid its taxes and filed its census records and sent its young people to serve in the Republic military when service was required. Mid-sized population. Mixed species, as most colonies' worlds were by this period. The economy ran on agricultural output and light manufacturing. Reliable. Unglamorous. The kind of contribution that keeps a civilization supplied without ever receiving recognition for doing so. The kind of world that exists so that other worlds can function. The kind that nobody thinks carefully about until it is gone, and then the absence shows up first in the supply records and in the census columns before it registers anywhere else as a loss worth naming. Among its residents was a community whose ancestry traced to the borderlands between Republic and Sith territory. Not the Sith Empire, not soldiers, not operatives or current citizens of Naga Sado's domain in any meaningful sense. People whose great-grandparents or great-great-grandparents had come from worlds near the unmapped corridor. Traders in most cases, and a smaller number of families displaced by the periodic internal conflicts that had churned through Sith civilization across the centuries before anyone in the Republic knew those conflicts were occurring. They had arrived quietly, carrying what they could, looking for a place that would not require detailed explanations about where they had come from or what they had left behind. The Republic had not been asking careful questions about people from the eastern borderlands. So the families settled. They built households. They opened businesses. They planted crops in the agricultural zones outside the city and ran stalls in the commercial district and did the ordinary work of people trying to build something stable in a place willing to let them be stable. Their children grew up speaking Basic as their first language, using the ancestral Sith tongue only as a household matter, the kind of inherited speech that passes down through meals and ceremonies and gradually loses its daily function until it becomes something kept rather than practiced. Their grandchildren grew up knowing almost nothing of Korriban except the brief notation it received in public historical archives. A footnote in xenoarchaeological surveys. A line in early exploration records. A word that carried no weight because nobody had explained what weight it was supposed to carry. They were Republic citizens. They paid taxes. They voted in local elections. They sent their children to Republic schools. Some carried physical markers of Sith ancestry, skin tones running toward deep red in certain family lines, minor skeletal variations that appeared in medical records as passing notations, features not always visible in the course of daily life, features consistently present in the official documentation. The kind of detail that becomes a category when someone decides a category is needed. The documentation would become relevant later. It always does. When Sato's forces crossed into Republic space, the security apparatus of the colony's region activated standing protocols. These had been drafted years earlier, during a period of general military preparedness. The committee that produced them worked under deadline pressure with limited resources. The precise condition under which most administrative frameworks that later cause serious harm are created. The protocols covered border monitoring, evacuation staging, infrastructure protection, and the expansion of intelligence operations in affected zones. They also contained a section, written later in the drafting process, by a smaller group with less oversight, covering the identification and heightened surveillance of resident populations assessed as carrying elevated risk of sympathy toward hostile forces. The criteria for elevated risk had been assembled quickly, by people under significant pressure. In a working session that did not include representation from any of the communities the criteria would eventually be applied to. The criteria were broad, imprecise. They carried the appearance of thoroughness without its substance. The committee had decided this was acceptable, that these were surveillance guidelines, not enforcement mechanisms, and that the distinction between the two would hold once operational conditions arrived. The distinction did not hold. Distinctions like that rarely do when a war is moving fast, and the people making decisions are exhausted, and the pressure from above arrives daily with specific and escalating language. The intelligence report reached the Regional Security Office on the 6th of Memoria, one day before the date that neither calendar would record. It was formatted correctly. It used the precise vocabulary of credible intelligence work, source classifications, confidence ratings, cross-reference notations. The structural language that signals rigor to someone reading quickly under time pressure. The report claimed that an organized network within the Sith descended community had been transmitting Republic fleet positioning data to Sato's advance forces. It stated the network had been active for several weeks, and that information it provided had contributed to losses in 2 specific recent engagements. The report cited 3 independent sources. All 3, as investigation conducted considerably later would establish, were fabricated, not exaggerated from thin evidence, not the product of confused informants, constructed from nothing, by someone who understood exactly what credible intelligence looked like and had produced a document matching that appearance precisely while describing events that had never occurred. Who fabricated it? The surviving record does not say. For what purpose? A local grievance turned weapon under cover of wartime emergency. Pressure from above satisfied with manufactured results. Something else entirely. The record also does not say. What is established is that it was fabricated, and that the regional security commander who received it did not know this. He was not a careless man. He was not a man with particular hostility toward the community the report described. He was a man doing an impossible job under conditions specifically designed to produce errors, reading a document engineered to survive the level of scrutiny he had time to apply. He read the report at the end of a shift already 3 hours past its scheduled end. His office had processed 19 separate intelligence assessments in the previous 5 days. The invasion was continuing to advance. His superiors were sending daily communications, demanding demonstrated active response, in language that made the cost of inaction clear while keeping the definition of sufficient action deliberately vague. He authorized an action, not a detention order. Those required judicial review, created formal records, involved documented observers and legal protections that took time the authorization window did not allow. What he signed was categorized differently. It moved through a different administrative channel. That document has not been located in any surviving archive. What it authorized can only be reconstructed from what followed. The market on that planet's main commercial district opened at the start of First Watch, the same hour it always opened. 6th hour. The sky outside, still carrying the last dark of the night, the earliest gray beginning at the eastern horizon. That shift from black to almost blue that happens before anyone would properly call it dawn. The vendors had arrived before the opening, as they always did. Setting up required time, and the stalls needed to be ready when the first customers came through. The produce sellers arranged their goods in the careful way of people who have performed this task every morning for years. Each item placed where the display would say, "This was tended. This is worth stopping for." The cloth vendors draped their fabric over the display frames in the order that presented the most appealing pieces at the front. The woman who sold preserved goods stacked her containers with her highest margin products at eye level and her secondary stock at the outer edges, an arrangement she had refined across a decade of working the same stall in the same district. The vendor near the east entrance, who prepared food to order, had started his cooking oil heating early. He always started early. The smell drifted across the market before the first customers arrived. Over years, this had become a signal for the district. When the oil smell reached you, the morning had officially begun, and the day was open for business. Everything was arranged. Nobody had been told anything. There was nothing to tell. It was the 7th of Memoria, the start of First Watch, and the market was open the way it had been open every morning that the people of that district could remember, and the day had not yet become the day it was going to become. This is the testimony. One fragment, one survivor, not named, given to a Jedi investigator whose name is also absent, at a location not recorded, on a date not recorded. The fragment was recovered from a sealed container at a facility on Telerath, found alongside water-damaged cargo manifests, and 3 personal letters addressed to people who could not subsequently be identified. Nobody knows how the container came to be there. Nobody knows who placed it there, or when, or why. The fragment reads, "The smell came before understanding. I knew from the smell before I was able to look clearly enough to understand from sight. I have been near burning before. Everyone who has lived through this war has. But this was different, because the burning was underneath the market smell, underneath the oil from the east entrance, underneath the cloth and the produce. Both at the same time, layered in a way that meant the market was still there, and something else was also there, and I could not separate them. The stalls were standing. Not every one, but enough that you could look down the row and see what the market had been an hour earlier. Cloth still draped in some places. Produce still arranged on several tables. The containers in her particular stacking order. It looked like a morning that had stopped in the middle of itself. Like someone had reached into an ordinary hour and paused it and left. The first section had no one alive. In the second section I found 3 people still living. One of them had known me since I was young. She looked at me and tried to form words. I could not hear what she was trying to say. I stayed beside her until she was no longer trying to say anything. Children come to the market in the morning. This did not need explaining to anyone who knew that district. Children come with their parents at first watch because that is what mornings look like in a neighborhood like that. Anyone who came to that market on any ordinary first watch would have understood this immediately. I have tried since then to believe it happened in confusion and speed, without deliberate choices being made about specific things. That version is easier to carry inside yourself day after day. But near the far end of the second section, at one of the produce stalls, the cloth at the table's edge had been folded, neatly folded and placed to one side. Not knocked aside, not fallen, folded. Someone had stopped and taken the time to do this deliberately. I have spent a long time since then unable to stop thinking about what it means when someone takes the time to fold the cloth. I have not found an understanding. I do not believe I will find one. I left before the security forces came back through. I did not look behind me. I have not returned. I do not know what there is to return to. The Jedi investigators submitted a report. It was classified under a designation that no longer appears in the standard archive index. Whether this reflects administrative reorganization, deliberate relocation, or destruction during post-war archive purges cannot be determined from available evidence. What happened in that market was never entered into the official record of either side. 3 fragmentary accounts exist across scattered sources. They agree on almost nothing. They agree on the smell. The security commander's office files for the 7th of Memoria contain standard administrative entries, supply authorization requests, a personnel reassignment approval, a response to a Senate inquiry about evacuation procedures in the outer residential zones, ordinary work, the routine documentation of a functioning security operation during active wartime. Nothing in his files marks the 7th of Memoria as different from the 6th or the 8th or any other day in his long service record. His files for the 8th show the same pattern, the 9th as well. He remained in his position for the duration of the conflict without formal inquiry. He retired afterward with a commendation noting consistent performance under difficult operational circumstances. The commendation is in the archive. The authorization is not. The community had maintained one practice from their ancestral heritage, small enough to survive long assimilation without becoming visible to outsiders. On the final night of each month, the eldest person in each household would light a lamp and place it in the window facing east. The original meaning had blurred across generations until what remained was only the act itself, the lamp, the placement, the direction. Something done because it had always been done, connected to an origin that most people who observed it could describe only in approximate terms. Something about light and direction and where their people had first come from. The lamps had been lit on the final night of the previous month. They burned through the dark and went out in the morning when the oil ran low, as they always had. On the final night of Memoria, no lamps were placed in the eastern windows. The month after that, no lamps. The year after, no lamps. Not ever again. The windows faced east. The light did not come from them anymore. The market district was cleaned. A public works authorization, filed 6 days after the date in question, directed the municipal sanitation service to address hygiene concerns in the main commercial zone. The document does not describe the nature of those concerns or explain how they arose. The work was completed in 2 days. A follow-up assessment noted the district had been restored to operational condition and that commercial activity had resumed at reduced capacity. The vendors who returned set up their stalls. They laid the cloth. They arranged the goods. The east entrance stall was empty for some weeks. Eventually, someone new took it. The oil heated again in the mornings, the same as before. Life continued the way it continues when there is no available alternative, not because what had happened had been addressed or explained or made into something that fit inside the shape of justice, but because the structure of daily life does not pause for those processes. The morning comes. The market opens. The cloth is laid. This does not mean things are repaired. It means the morning came. The narrator does not explain why this happened. Not because the mechanics are unknown. The chain of decisions is reconstructible. The pressures that produced each authorization are historically recognizable. The specific failure at each administrative point has a shape that anyone familiar with how atrocities move through bureaucratic systems would identify without difficulty. The explanation exists. It is not offered here, because explanation is not the same as accounting. Accounting is not justice. Justice is not restoration. And none of these things are the same as the smell of heating oil and burning cloth at the start of first watch on a morning when the market had opened at its usual hour, and the goods were arranged, and the cloth was laid, and nobody had been told anything yet. Both calendars carry the date. The 7th of Memoria, the 19th of Massassi Tide. Neither records this event. The survivors dispersed into the outer rim, finding the particular invisibility available to people for whom being located has become a form of danger. The investigator filed the report. The commander received his commendation. The market resumed at reduced capacity. The eastern windows stayed dark. This occurred on a date both sides recorded and neither explained. In a war that produced, alongside its named engagements and strategic calculations, events that the official record was not structured to contain. The script moves on, not because this is finished, because the war did not stop for this, and that is itself part of what this chapter is about. Silence, the length of one breath, no image, just what remains when all the words stop. The Senate War Committee met in a room that had no windows. This was deliberate. The architects who designed the chamber, 3 centuries before any of the people currently sitting in it had been born, had decided that rooms where serious decisions are made should not offer the people making those decisions a view of the world those decisions would affect. The thinking was that the view would complicate the deciding. The reasoning, as preserved in the original architectural notes, was clarity of focus. The effect, as experienced by anyone who spent extended time inside, was something closer to, the world does not exist while we are in here. Both things were simultaneously true. Neither was the point. The second meeting of the Republic Senate War Committee during the Great Hyperspace War convened on the 22nd of Arbiter, the month of judicial deliberation, when courts traditionally ran extended sessions and proceedings moved at their most formal pace. The scheduling was not commentary. The Senate calendar did not reorganize itself around the war. The war was required to fit into the existing schedule, the way all events that disrupt institutional routine are eventually made to fit, inserted into the spaces between what the institution was already doing. 11 senators attended in person. 4 participated through secure communication relay from their home systems, which were geographically closer to the active engagement zones. and therefore more difficult to leave without creating the appearance of withdrawal from the people who needed them present. The 4 attending by relay are acknowledged in the opening lines of the official transcript and do not appear in the record again. The 11 physically in the room are the ones whose voices are most completely preserved. The ones on the relay were the ones whose systems the war was actively touching. This is how most records work. The first agenda item concerned the deployment of additional Jedi forces to active engagement zones. The Republic had committed approximately 40% of available Jedi combat personnel to the front at this stage of the conflict. The question before the committee was whether to increase this to 60%, as the military command had formally requested, or maintain the current threshold and redistribute existing deployments more efficiently, as the Jedi Council had formally recommended. The military command's reasoning was direct. A higher Jedi concentration at the front would accelerate engagement resolution, which would reduce total casualties over the full duration of the conflict. The Jedi Council's reasoning was equally direct. Concentrating 60% of combat-capable Jedi in a single theater would leave the remainder of the Republic's territory with a force-sensitive presence inadequate for anything that developed outside the primary engagement zone. The war had one visible front. Wars with one visible front had a persistent tendency to develop a second one at the moment of least preparation. Both positions were correct. The committee debated both for 40 minutes and voted to deploy 55%, a number that satisfied neither party, which is the most common result when two sides who are both substantially right have requirements that cannot be simultaneously honored. The vote was recorded. The Jedi Council's reservations were formally noted. The military timeline was adjusted. Nobody in the room would be among the 55%. The transcript does not note this. The private letters of Senator Orin Velas of the Koros system survived because she kept her personal archive on Alderaan rather than on Coruscant. She had developed this practice early in her Senate career for reasons unrelated to posterity. She preferred records in a location independent of the capital's administrative systems. She could not have anticipated that this habit would determine what survived. It determined what survived. Senator Velas represented a system that had been in the direct path of Sato's advance. 2 of Koros's outer installations had been destroyed entirely in the opening weeks of the invasion. The evacuation of the 3rd had been partially successful, a phrase used in the official military report that described an outcome without specifying what that outcome had cost the people it happened to. Her letters specify it. She wrote to her personal secretary 3 days before the meeting, "I will go into that room, and they will discuss deployment numbers and infrastructure costs and the amnesty proposal. They will use the language that careful, exhausted people use when they are trying to make irreducible things into manageable things. I will sit there and remember the emergency footage from the 3rd station. I will say the words that belong to me. I will vote the way the evidence directs. I will come home. I will do it again." She did not write, "I do not know how long I can continue doing this." She wrote something that arrived at the same place 4 letters later, while discussing something she believed she was handling well. The second agenda item was infrastructure recovery. 7 systems had returned to Republic control in the previous 6 weeks. The military designation was recovered. The word accurately described the military situation. It communicated nothing about the condition of what had been taken back. Senator Velas had personally visited one of those systems before the meeting. She had insisted on the visit over the objection of her security detail, on the grounds that people making decisions about rebuilding allocations should have direct knowledge of what rebuilding actually entailed. She had seen it. Her written account was included in the committee's pre-session materials. The damage assessment figures that followed it were discussed at length. Her account was not referenced during the session. 2 senators requested methodological clarification on specific figures in the damage assessment. One senator observed that the projected rebuilding schedule appeared to conflict with an existing infrastructure contract held by a commercial consortium in the Mid-Rim, and asked how priority allocation between emergency rebuilding and pre-existing contractual obligations would be handled. Senator Velas answered the methodological questions in full. She did not respond to the contract question. The committee chair noted the contract inquiry for separate follow-up and advanced the session to the total cost figures. The totals were significant. Several senators expressed concern. The totals were significant because the systems had been systematically destroyed. The committee addressed the figures as a resource allocation challenge, which they were, without simultaneously addressing them as documentation of what had been done to the populations of those systems, which they also were. Both framings were accurate. The committee worked inside one of them. Senator Velas voted to authorize the full rebuilding allocation. A reduced figure was approved instead, with a provision for additional review in the following budget period. That period was 11 weeks away. The people in the recovered systems were not in this room. They were in the recovered systems. The amnesty proposal was introduced by Senator Velas as the 3rd agenda item. It had not been on the original agenda. She submitted it as a procedural addendum 4 days before the meeting, within the allowable submission window. Unusual enough that 2 other committee members sent private notes asking whether she had the chair's advance knowledge. She had not sought it. The proposal was specific. The Republic, through a secure and deniable intermediary channel, would offer limited amnesty to Sith Imperial military commanders willing to provide verified intelligence on Sato's fleet movements, forward supply positions, and patrol scheduling. Not to Sato, not to his Sith lords. To the command tier below, the people coordinating logistics and running patrol rotations for an invasion force that significant numbers of them had not chosen to join. The Republic intelligence assessment attached to the proposal identified that a meaningful subset of these commanders had factional interests running counter to Sato's success. Sato had launched this war partly to neutralize internal opposition within the Empire. Several commanders in his invasion force were connected to that very opposition. If Sato won, it would complete their political elimination as surely as any military defeat from outside. This created, the assessment concluded, a genuine intelligence opportunity with a limited and declining window. Senator Velas presented the proposal carefully. The objections arrived in sequence. Any amnesty extended to Sith commanders risked public perception that the Republic was negotiating with the invasion force, regardless of confidentiality. The political consequences of that perception would be severe. Intelligence obtained through such a channel could not be reliably verified. A deliberate Sith misdirection operation through a compromised amnesty channel would cause more damage than the absence of the intelligence would have. The legal framework required for this specific amnesty type did not currently exist. Creating it required full Senate deliberation. Full Senate deliberation would take longer than the projected conflict timeline. Senator Velas addressed each without changing her pace or register. The operation could be conducted without public announcement. The methodology included verification protocols designed specifically for potentially compromised sources, outlined in the attached appendix. The committee held emergency legislative authority that had been invoked for considerably less urgent purposes twice in the previous decade. The vote was called. The proposal failed by 2 votes. Both votes against came from senators whose systems were not in the path of the invasion, whose outer installations were intact, whose populations had not required evacuation, partial or otherwise, and had not appeared in any military report requiring careful reading to understand. Senator Velas wrote about this that evening in a private letter. She used few words. She did not write unjust. She wrote familiar. The difference between those 2 words is the entire distance between someone still capable of being surprised and someone who has stopped. Jory Darragon was brought before the committee after the formal agenda concluded. She had been waiting in the outer chamber for 2 hours. The outer chamber had chairs arranged along one wall, a water dispenser, and a window that faced an internal corridor rather than any exterior view. It was a room designed to hold people while decisions were made about things that concerned them. She sat. She drank water when she was thirsty. She did not look at the window. The committee asked her about 3 things: what she had directly observed of Sith military structure and command organization during her time in Sith space, what she could describe about the hyperspace corridor she had transited, its navigational characteristics, the gravitational drift that had displaced their emergence point, the configuration of the lane she and Gav had followed out of Republic space and into something that had no name in any Republic chart. What she knew about the locator device, the instrument Sato had given her, presented as a gift, that had functioned as a guide for his fleet through the gap in the map she had accidentally opened. She answered all 3 areas with the completeness and precision that 2 weeks of debriefing had organized into her. She answered without visible anger and without the quality some witnesses carry into formal proceedings, the need for the room to understand what the experience had cost, for the record to hold the weight alongside the facts. That need had been worked through somewhere between the rescue and this chamber. What remained was the information. She delivered the information. The committee chair thanked her for her clarity and her cooperation. She was directed back to the outer chamber. She sat in the chair she had occupied before. Through the sealed chamber doors she could hear the committee continuing its procedural work. The muffled rhythm of governance, motions, seconds, recorded votes, filtered through the soundproofing into an indistinct pattern that sounded, at this remove, as though everything passing through it received equal weight. She knew it did not. She sat with that knowledge in the outer chamber and did not move toward it, because there was nowhere useful to take it from where she was sitting. Somewhere in Sith space, at approximately the same hour, Gav Darragon was writing, not a message, not yet, a document that did not look like what it was. He had access, through the conditional freedom Sato had extended as part of the ongoing calculation about his usefulness, to station manifests and operational schedules that crossed his awareness as routine administrative material, not classified at a level that prevented a supervised guest from encountering them incidentally. Individually, they said very little. In aggregate, across weeks of careful and unhurried attention, they said a great deal. He had been paying that attention since the 4th day of his limited freedom. He had not written any of it down until now. Written things become evidence. Evidence found where it should not be ends the ability to write. He wrote now because the accumulated material had grown beyond what he trusted his memory to hold at the precision required. He used the operational shorthand he and Jory had developed across years of shared work, the compressed notation that looked, to any reader who had not built it alongside them, like a personal accounting log, or the navigation record of a vessel running unusual cargo. Patrol rotation schedules and their timing gaps, supply corridor configurations, and the windows between resupply runs. The specific coverage absence that opened every 8 days in the approach sector toward Republic space. A window of approximately 6 hours when 2 patrol assignments overlapped with a logistics transit, and neither was fully staffed at the handover point. He wrote this last entry twice. He was writing toward Jory without knowing precisely where she was. The way she had sent her signal into a carrier frequency without knowing if it would arrive. He would find a way to send it. He always had. He folded the document and placed it in the concealed interior pocket of the jacket they had allowed him to keep. The pocket he had used for cargo manifests on routes where the cargo required discretion. He had been waiting for a reason to need that pocket again. The committee concluded at the end of third watch. The transcript was sealed, distributed to relevant departments, and filed in the Senate archive on Coruscant under the standard wartime committee classification. Senator Velas left the chamber last. She walked through the outer chamber. The chairs along the wall were empty. She did not know who had been sitting in them. She left the building. Outside, Coruscant continued its operation, the perpetual inhabited volume of a world without a natural day cycle, the institutional lighting that approximated one, the city that did not stop for anything. The war was not visible from here. It was in the transcript and the cost figures and the failed vote and the testimony of a woman who had answered questions with precision and left the room. It was in the notation folded inside a jacket lining in Sith space. It was in the gap between what the committee had decided and what it had declined to decide, which would widen before the war ended and remain after it did. It was not visible from the street. Coruscant continued. The windowless room sat empty in the Senate complex, clean, temperature-controlled, evenly lit, designed for the comfort and focus of the people who used it, undisturbed by any view of what those people were deciding about. It was not a failure of design. It was the design, working exactly as intended. That was the part that could not be argued with. It was also the part that could not be corrected. These two things were not unrelated. The war had one more turn left in it. Both of them felt this, separately, without knowing the other felt it too. Not a strategic assessment, not intelligence, just the specific exhaustion of someone who has been inside something long enough to feel its shape changing beneath them, the way a storm feels different in its last hour than it did at the start. The shape was changing. Jory received the intelligence briefing on the 3rd of Fortis, the Republic's month of endurance, which had not been chosen deliberately but felt, to the people living inside this particular Fortis, like the calendar understood something about them. The briefing came from a Republic naval intelligence officer, mid-ranking, professional in the specific way of people whose job requires them to present information without becoming attached to it. He told her a Republic fleet was preparing a final coordinated assault on Sado's primary Sith meditation sphere. The sphere was the source, the instrument through which Sado had extended his power, projected his illusions, multiplied his apparent fleet strength. Destroy the sphere and you dismantled the mechanism that had made this invasion possible, he told her. The fleet needed navigational consultation on the corridor approach. Specifically, the lane configuration through the eastern Tion border, the route she had transited on the Starbreaker 12, the route no Republic navigator had logged from direct experience. She was being asked if she would help. She did not deliberate long. She said yes. She said yes the way she had filed the original route application on Tion Station. Not impulsively, not without understanding what she was agreeing to. but with the specific economy of someone who has already done all the deliberating she is going to do, who arrived at this decision some time ago without fully noticing, and is now only confirming what she already knows. She had been moving toward this since the moment the docking port sealed between them. Every step since then, the cell, the carrier frequency signal, the debriefings, the testimony before the war committee, the waiting, had been movement in the direction of the thing that would end this, the thing that would let her stop waiting. She said yes. She signed what needed signing. She returned to the navigational console she had been assigned and began plotting the corridor approach with the precision of someone who had run that lane in their own ship and knew where the gravitational drift pulled and where the emergence point would fall if you did not compensate for the variance in the survey data. She knew where it would fall. She had come out wrong the first time and learned from it. She would not come out wrong again. She thought about Gav while she worked, not continuously. The work required her full attention, and she gave it, but in the pauses between calculations, in the small spaces where her hands moved automatically and her mind was briefly unoccupied, she thought about him. She thought, he is still alive. She thought, he is still the direction I am moving toward. She thought, this is the last move. After this, the direction resolves into arrival or it resolves into something else, and either way the waiting ends. She had been moving toward him since Tyon Station. She was still moving. Gav sent the coordinates on the same day. He did not know Jory had agreed to anything. He did not know the Republic fleet was preparing. He did not know that the transmission he was preparing would intersect with a military operation already in motion. He knew only what he had observed, and what he had written down, and what the folded document in the jacket lining told him about the window in the patrol coverage. The window opened that day. He had been watching for it for 3 weeks. 6 hours, recurring every 8 days. The gap where 2 patrol assignments and 1 logistics run overlapped at the handover point and left the approach corridor toward Republic space briefly unmonitored. He had 4 of those 6 hours remaining when he moved. Getting to a transmission point had required 2 weeks of patient preparation, not dramatic preparation. Quiet preparation, the kind that looks, if anyone is watching, like nothing in particular. Learning which station sections were monitored at which intervals. Learning which maintenance corridors were logged by automated systems and which relied on personnel who had patterns as predictable as automated systems. Learning that the communications array in the secondary maintenance hub ran a diagnostic cycle every 48 hours that left it accessible for 11 minutes before the monitoring system completed its restart. He had learned all of this the way he had learned everything useful in his life, by paying attention for long enough that the pattern became visible and then waiting for the pattern to create an opening. The opening existed. He moved through it. The transmission took 4 minutes. He had compressed the information into the shortest signal he could construct, the patrol gaps, the fleet positions, the corridor window, the timing, encoded in the operational shorthand, addressed in the carrier frequency notation Jory had used in her original signal to him. He did not know if it would reach her. He did not know if it would reach anyone useful. He sent it toward Republic space, into the frequency they had built together across years of working the same routes from the same ship, and trusted that the direction was right, even when the destination was not confirmed. He returned to his section of the station before the monitoring system completed its diagnostic restart. Nobody noted his absence. The maintenance log recorded the corridor as inactive during the relevant period. He sat in the room they had given him and waited. He had become very good at waiting. The mirror, completed. This is what neither of them knew about the other. Jory, at her navigational console, was computing the approach vector for a Republic fleet heading toward the place where Gav was. Gav, in his room on a Sith station, had just transmitted the information that would allow that fleet to reach its target. They were moving toward each other. They had been moving toward each other since the docking port sealed. Every decision either of them had made, every calculation, every risk taken, everything endured, had been motion in the same direction. They did not know this. They knew only their own portion of it. This is how love works when a war gets inside it. It does not stop being love. It becomes something that operates without confirmation, without visibility, without the ordinary feedback that lets people know their movement is being received. You move. You trust the direction. You do not wait for confirmation before the next step. On Coruscant, the fleet departure was filed and processed and approved. On a Sith station in Sith space, Gav sat in his room and watched the stars through the viewport and thought about Jory. He thought, she is still alive. He thought, I have done everything I can do from here. The next part is not mine to do. He thought about the inscription on the sleeping room wall in the Sith archive projection. The parents' words, written into stone for a child who had been born in a dark season. You were born in a dark season, and you will find your own light. He had been thinking about that inscription since the archivist closed the projection and walked away. He thought about it now. He did not know if what he had done would be enough. He knew that it was everything he had. The Republic fleet entered hyperspace at the start of Fourth Watch. Jory was aboard the lead navigational vessel, at the console, watching the coordinates she had plotted resolve into the blue-white corridor of faster-than-light transit. The corridor was the same corridor it always was, the non-place between stars, the endless blue-white, the feeling of being nowhere between two somewheres. She had been here before. The last time, she had come out wrong. The last time, the port-side sensor cluster had lagged and she had logged the gravitational variance as instrument error and filed it under maintenance and moved on, and everything that followed had followed. This time, she had compensated for the variance. This time, she knew where the drift would pull. The fleet moved through the corridor. She watched the navigation display. She thought about Gav. She thought, this is the last move. She thought, I am still moving toward you. In his room on the Sith station, Gav felt the change before anything confirmed it. Not the Force. He was not sensitive to the Force in any way he could have named. Just the specific sensation of someone who has been inside a situation long enough to feel its pressure change the way a shift in weather pressure changes in the body. Before any instrument registers it, something was different. The station was conducting its ordinary routines. Nothing visible had altered, but something had changed in the weight of things. He sat with this. He had learned, in the months inside this place, to sit with uncertainty without requiring it to resolve before he was ready to act. He sat. He waited. Whatever was coming was already in motion. He had put everything he had into its path. The rest was not his. The hyperspace corridor held the fleet. Jory held the course. The navigation display moved through its calculations with the quiet efficiency of a system doing what it was built to do. She was doing what she was built to do, not built by anyone else's design, built by years of managing a difficult life at thin margins, by the specific competence that accumulates in people who cannot afford to be incompetent. by the particular quality of endurance that does not feel like strength from the inside but functions like it from the outside. She was here. She was doing the work. She was still moving toward him. The corridor held. The fleet moved through it. The navigation display read, estimated emergence, 4 hours. She set a reminder. She kept working. The war ended the way most things end. Not with a single decisive moment, not with a sound or a signal or a clear line between what was happening and what had stopped. It ended in accumulation, smaller events piling onto each other until the combined weight tipped something that had been suspended for a long time. And what had been present tense became past tense without anyone being able to identify the exact hour of the chain. The final engagement at the remnant of Primus Golud's dead star took 3 hours. Republic records describe it in the language of military outcomes, fleet positions, engagement vectors, damage assessments, the clinical accounting of a battle reduced to its measurable components. What those records do not describe is what it looked like from the navigational console of the lead Republic vessel, where Jory Daragon sat with both hands on the plotting controls and watched the approach vector she had calculated resolve into something real. The fleet had come through the corridor gap exactly as mapped. Her coordinates had been accurate. The transmission that had arrived through the carrier frequency, encoded in the shorthand that only 2 people in the galaxy had ever used, sent from inside Sith space by a hand she recognized in every compressed notation, had been accurate too. Together, both sources had brought the fleet in through the one window in the patrol coverage that Sado had not accounted for. The meditation sphere's defensive configuration, metaformation it had not anticipated from a direction it had not prepared for. 3 hours. Then, it was over. Naga Sado survived. The Republic Military Archive records this in a single line of a battle report, filed between the fleet casualty figures and the logistical summary, in the same register used for all factual notations regardless of their weight. Dark Lord Naga Sado. Status, fled. Last confirmed trajectory, outer systems, direction unspecified. Threat assessment, significantly reduced. Significantly reduced. Not eliminated. The people who wrote the report understood the distinction. The people who would read it over the following decades would understand it too, though the understanding would arrive differently for each generation. First as a footnote, then as a historical asterisk, then as the explanation for things that came much later and cost much more. But for the purposes of this war, the specific conflict that had begun when the Starbreaker 12 came out of hyperspace in the wrong system, Sado was gone. His fleet was gone. The Sith Empire, already fractured by the parallel internal war between Sado and Ludo Kresh, did not survive the loss of both its primary contenders. Kresh had died before the final Republic engagement even concluded, killed in the factional violence that Sado's departure had accelerated. Sado had fled into the outer dark. The Sith as a political civilization, as the thing that had built layered cities on Korriban's red cliffs, that had inscribed prayers on sleeping room walls for children born in dark seasons, that had maintained an empire older than most Republic institutions, did not survive this war in any form resembling what they had been. This was the victory. This was what winning looked like. Republic vessels began returning to home systems on the 4th day after the final engagement. It was not a celebration. It was a logistical operation. Ships sorted by damage assessment, medical priority cases flagged, return routes calculated against fuel reserves. The crews moved through assigned tasks with the competence of people who had been performing these tasks for a long time and were now performing them under a different kind of pressure, the pressure of something being over, Stopping is harder than it sounds. The body and the mind, calibrated over months to wartime requirements, do not immediately recalibrate when those requirements are lifted. The heightened attention, the constant readiness, the specific alertness that combat operations demand, these continue running at operational capacity for a while after the operation ends, processing ordinary things as if those things still require the same vigilance that battle required. The crews talked about return routes, about what they would do when they reached their home stations, about small things, forward-facing things. Nobody spoke much about what had just happened. The past was very close. Everyone kept their eyes on what was ahead. Jory was aboard the navigational vessel on the 3-day return to Coruscant. The cabin assigned to her was small and functional, with a viewport that showed the hyperspace corridor during transit and showed stars when the fleet dropped into real space for system checks. The first day back, Jory stayed in the cabin, not out of distress, nothing that required anyone's attention. The Republic liaison checked in once, mid-morning, and found her sitting at the small desk looking at the viewport, and asked if she needed anything, and she said no, and the liaison left, and that was the only interruption. The corridor glowed outside the viewport, that endless blue-white, the non-place between stars, the feeling of being suspended between a past location and a future one, committed to neither. Gav had loved this. The corridor, the specific sensation of transit that he described not as displacement but as potential, the particular openness of a moment when you have not yet arrived, and therefore have not yet encountered whatever the arriving will require of you. Jory had never fully understood this until now. She understood it now. On the second day, Jory went to the mess. The table near the viewport was empty. Sitting there, back to the room, eyes on the corridor light, that was manageable. That was a way to eat a meal without the meal requiring anything beyond the mechanical business of eating. A junior communications officer occupied the adjacent table. Not with her, just in the nearest available seat. They exchanged the minimal nod of people sharing a space without sharing a conversation. The officer ate. Jory ate. Neither spoke. The corridor held outside the viewport. 3 years before Tion Station, on a cargo run through the Honegger system, the Starbreaker 12's port-side sensor cluster had returned an anomalous reading at the edge of its range, a gravitational density variance. Something the cluster could detect but not precisely identify, given its known calibration fault. Jory had looked at it for 45 seconds. She had run a secondary sweep. The secondary sweep, filtered through the same faulty cluster, had returned a milder version of the same signal, consistent with instrument drift. She had logged it as instrument error. She had marked the sensor for maintenance. She had moved on. The reading had been the edge of the Sith corridor, 3 light hours away. Real, specific, the opening of a lane that ran toward Korriban and Ziost, and the civilization that had been waiting on the other side of the map's edge for longer than the Republic had existed. She had looked at it for 45 seconds and filed it under maintenance. The war had been 3 light hours away, and she had filed it. Jory finished her food. She returned to the cabin. She did not examine this too closely. There was nothing useful to do with it, and she had learned, over the course of the past year, the difference between thoughts that could be worked through and thoughts that could only be sat with until they settled into a position that allowed movement. This was the second kind. Coruscant appeared on the 7th morning. Enormous. Self-illuminated. A world that had replaced its own surface with itself so thoroughly That planet and civilization had merged into a single continuous thing. The distinction between the ground and what had been built on the ground long since irrelevant. Jory looked at it from the viewport for a while. She had no particular relationship with this place. The debriefings, the committee testimony, the administrative meetings, those had been her entire experience of the Republic's capital, and none of them had given her anything that felt like familiarity. It was a very large place. It did not feel like an arrival. It felt like the next step in a sequence that had not yet completed. The formal debriefing lasted 2 days. 3 analysts, 2 from intelligence, 1 senior military liaison, in a room more comfortable than the previous debriefing rooms, which was not coincidental. The war was over. The Republic's posture toward Jory had shifted from necessary witness to obligation being fulfilled. The chairs were better. The water was cold when offered. The analysts covered the final engagement in detail. The approach vector, the navigational calculations, the relationship between the coordinates she had plotted, and the transmission data that had arrived through the carrier frequency. They asked about the transmission. They framed the question carefully, the language of people who want information without wanting the person providing it to feel the weight of what the question is actually asking. Jory told them what she knew. The encoding was a system she and her brother had developed across years of shared work. Shorthand, compressed notation, a private language built from necessity on cargo runs and tight budgets, and the particular intimacy of 2 people who had spent years depending on each other in small spaces. Only 2 people could have sent that transmission in that encoding. Jory was one of them. Jory had not sent it. She delivered this information in the same register she had used for every other piece of information in the debriefing, accurately, completely, without the quality that testimony sometimes carries, when the witness is also receiving the information as new in the moment of speaking it. The information was not new to Jory. She had known it since the transmission arrived. She had held it at a specific distance and continued her work, because Gav had sent the transmission so that she would continue her work, and she was not going to fail him on that count. The analyst noted her account. Was there anything else about the transmission she could provide? Jory considered. The compression pattern, the hierarchy of the information, patrol gaps first, then fleet positions, then the corridor window, then the timing. The same order she would have used. The same system of priorities they had developed together across years of working the same routes. She said, "It was written the way I would have written it." The analyst noted this. The debriefing continued. At the close of the 2nd day, the senior liaison placed the administrative settlement document on the table. Several pages, formal language, the Republic's acknowledgement of Jory's contribution to the war effort, the resolution of the outstanding debt account associated with the Starbreaker 12, the ship's release from Republic Holding, the return of all personal items recovered from the vessel at the time of its initial impoundment, the debt figure, 0, the maintenance invoice that had lived in the deferred column since before the Tion route, paid, the docking registration, current, the Starbreaker 12, Bay 7, secondary civilian docking facility. The liaison said, "Your cooperation has been noted at the highest levels of Republic military command, and we appreciate your patience throughout this process." Jory said, "Thank you." The document was signed. A copy was folded and placed in a jacket pocket. Jory stood, thanked the team for their time, and left the room. The corridor outside was long and well lit and quiet. Walking its length required no particular thought. The elevator bank at the end, the transit to the docking facility, the main entrance, the registration desk, the maintenance service windows, the public terminals. The turn toward the secondary bays. Bay 7. The Starbreaker 12 looked the same. That was the first thought. Standing at the entrance to the bay, it looks the same. The hull markings unchanged. The running light configuration the same. The slight asymmetry in the portside panel join. A repair done before Jory had acquired the ship. Done adequately but imperfectly. Still visible in the same position it had always occupied. Up the boarding ramp. Through the corridor to the operations bay. The Republic maintenance crew had cleaned the ship as part of the return procedure. Everything in its correct position. The outstanding maintenance items, the ones covered by the settlement, addressed. The operations bay had the specific quality of a space that has been tended by someone who did not know it, which is different from the quality of a space tended by someone who does. It was clean. It was not the same as it had been when Gav was in the Nav Bay, and Jory was at the operations terminal, and the ship was running the way it ran when two people who knew every fault and quirk of it were managing it together. Jory sat at the operations terminal. No files opened, just sitting. The understanding arrived in the way of things held at a distance for a long time. Not as sudden realization, but as settling. The way sediment settles in water that has been disturbed and is now, finally, still, slow, in layers. Each layer finding its resting place above the one beneath it, until the whole picture is present and clear and permanent. Gav was not coming. He had been inside Sith space when the engagement ended. In a station in a region where the Republic had no operational presence. The mechanisms that had kept him there, Sato's authority, the Sith Empire's administrative structure, were gone now. But the mechanisms that might have carried him out were also gone. No Republic extraction operation, no Sith infrastructure to release him through formal channels, no active military presence in that corridor at all. Just the vast space between where he was and where Jory was, and the last known record of his location in a transmission encoded in a language that two people had built together over years, sent through a gap in patrol coverage that he had mapped himself, timed precisely to the window he had identified, compressed into the information that had guided a fleet to its target. The last thing Gav Daragon had done was point everything he knew in Jory's direction. The last thing. She sat with this. She did not collapse. She did not make any sound. She sat in the specific stillness of someone who has arrived at the weight they have been carrying toward themselves for a long time, and now has it, fully settled into place. No longer approaching. Here. The stillness was not peace. It was not despair either. It was the particular condition of someone who has arrived at the thing they knew was coming and is now in it, without drama, without the performance of either grief or composure, just present inside the full weight of it. Every decision since Tion Station, the route application, the cursor on the confirmation button, the yes, the cell on the Sith ship, counting exits, encoding a message into a carrier frequency, pointing Gav in a direction, the testimony before the War Committee, delivering information with the precision that 2 weeks of debriefing had organized into responses. The navigational console on the Republic vessel, plotting an approach vector through a corridor she had transited once before in the wrong direction for the wrong reasons, and now transited again, correctly, for a reason she had been moving toward since the docking port closed. Every decision since Tion had been in Gav's direction. The direction had always been toward him, toward getting back, toward ending the thing that had separated them, toward the reunion that had existed as a fixed point in every calculation, every plan, every endurance of everything that had to be endured. The direction ended here, not at a reunion, not at anything with the shape of arrival that the direction had implied. At Bay 7, at the operations terminal of a ship that looked the same, at the absence of the person who should have been in the Nav Bay. The direction ended here, and learning to move in a different direction would take time she had not yet started to calculate, and she was not going to start calculating it yet. Not today. The portside sensor cluster ran its startup diagnostic at some point during the time Jory sat at the terminal. Time was not being tracked precisely. The diagnostic returned its reading, 2% off baseline. The familiar lag. The persistent fault that had been in the cluster since before Jory had acquired the ship. The fault that had lived in the deferred maintenance column for as long as either of them could remember. The fault that the Republic maintenance crew, working through the settlement provision, had either assessed as below priority threshold or had missed entirely. Still there, 2% off baseline. Still exactly where it had always been. Jory noted it the way the body notes things it has been trained to notice. Before the conscious mind decides to pay attention, the recognition already complete. She thought about Gav writing deferred. Operator compensates in the maintenance log in his slightly too tight stylus grip. Concentrating on something else. Moving to the next item. She thought about the tea. Always ready when she came back from walking. Never announced. Never made into something that required acknowledgement. Just there. She thought, I never told him I noticed every time. She sat with this. She sat for a long time. The chapter does not describe the length of time. It says only, she sat. And then, not because the weight lifted, not because the settled thing became lighter or the absence became smaller or any of the facts changed. Something in Jory oriented toward what was still available. The way a compass orients toward its fixed point, regardless of what surrounds it. Not by choice exactly, by nature, by the accumulated habit of a person who has spent an entire life finding the next viable path when the current one ended. There were routes to run. There were no debts now, but there would be new ones. There was a ship that looked the same. There was the specific competence that had built up in Jory across a difficult life at thin margins. The ability to calculate, to endure, to find what was still workable inside what had been lost. The war had not unmade that person. The war had added to that person weight, knowledge, the specific understanding that comes from having been inside something very large and very dark, and having come out the other side with the information about what the inside looks like. Both things were true. Neither thing changed what was still available to do. Jory reached for the startup sequence. The Starbreaker 12 systems came online in the order she had run them more times than she had counted. Power first, then navigation, then communications, then life support, then drive. Each system returning its status in the familiar sequence. The sounds that had long since stopped being sounds and become something closer to a language. A conversation between the ship and the person who knew it, about whether both were ready. The ship was ready. The portside sensor cluster completed its diagnostic. 2% off baseline. Jory noted it, did not flag it for repair. Filed it in the position it had always occupied. Known fault. Operator compensates. Deferred. Left it there. The departure request went to the docking facility at the standard filing interval. 4 minutes for a civilian vessel with current registration and a clean clearance record. Cleared. The docking bay doors opened on the station's outer hull. Deep space beyond. The stars. The specific darkness that is not empty, full of distance, full of systems not yet visited, full of routes not yet run, full of the ordinary immense business of a galaxy that had been having a war in one of its corners and was now beginning the slow work of continuing without that war. The Starbreaker 12 lifted off the bay floor. The drive vibration came up through the deck plates. That specific frequency, felt in the bones before the mind registers it. The sensation of a ship becoming operational, rising. The bay falling away below. The shadow of the station's outer hull, and then past the shadow, into the light. The nav system calculated. The attitude thrusters made their small corrections. The ship found its orientation and pointed itself toward open space. Jory set the first waypoint. She did not yet know the full destination. The first waypoint was the edge of Coruscant's traffic management zone, where the lanes opened into unscheduled transit, and there was no longer a single correct heading, and no authority specifying which direction to take. She would decide the rest when she got there. This had always been how it worked. The engines ran. The Starbreaker 12 moved through the approach lane, and through the traffic zone, and past the outer marker, and into the space where the galaxy opened in all directions, without preference. The portside sensor cluster monitored the surrounding region. 2% off baseline. Exactly as it had always been. Jory flew. 20 years is long enough for a war to become history. Not memory. History. The distinction matters. Memory is held by people who were inside the thing. History is what gets written down after enough of those people have died or moved on or simply stopped being asked about it. History has clean edges. Memory has none. 20 years after the Great Hyperspace War, the Republic had both. The people who had fought in it were still alive, mostly, still moving through their lives, carrying what they carried, compensating for what they had learned to compensate for. The mechanics who had repaired the ships, the senators who had sat in the windowless room, the soldiers who had eaten preserved grain rations on the front lines of worlds, whose names appeared in the battle records and nowhere else, still present, still breathing, still occasionally waking in the night with something that was not quite a dream and not quite a memory, and not quite either of those things, but some residue of both. The Republic had rebuilt what was destroyable, and rebuilt it well. The systems that Sato's forces had reached, the colony's worlds, the frontier installations, the outer stations that had taken the first impact of the invasion, had been reconstructed over the years following the war's end. Not perfectly, and not quickly, and not without the specific complications that arise when the money available for rebuilding is less than the scale of what needs rebuilding, but rebuilt, functional, populated again in most cases by people who had returned to their home systems after the evacuation, and found things different from what they had left, and made their accommodations with the difference. This is what civilizations do after wars. They continue, not because the continuing is easy, or because the grief has been resolved, or because the accounting has been completed, because the structure of daily life does not provide an alternative to continuing, and most people, faced with no alternative, continue. The Republic continued. The Jedi archives held the most complete record of the Great Hyperspace War that existed in any single location. This was not an accident. The Jedi had been in the war, had fought in it, had felt it, had carried its specific costs into the years that followed, and the Order had a long practice of documenting what it experienced. Holocrons, written records, oral testimonies preserved in formal archive sessions, the accumulated material of 1,000 years of institutional memory applied to the specific events of this specific conflict. New initiates studied the war as part of their historical curriculum. They learned the strategic facts, the invasion route, the key engagements, the defeat of Naga Sato at the remnant of Primus Golud's dead star, the collapse of the Sith Empire in the aftermath, the Republic's recovery, the long, slow return of the frontier systems to something resembling the lives they had maintained before the first Sith ships appeared on sensors that had never previously been asked to recognize that kind of contact. They learned about Gav and Jori Daragon, the human siblings whose navigation mistake had opened the corridor, whose subsequent actions had shaped the war's resolution. The initiates read the account with the specific attention of students who understand they are looking at something historically significant, and are therefore looking slightly past the human texture of it toward the significance. This is what historical distance does. It makes the human texture harder to see. They did not learn the name of the colony's district where the market had been open at first watch on the 7th of Memoria. The record that would have told them was gone. The Jedi investigators' report, classified under a designation that no longer appeared in the standard index, had not survived the post-war archive reorganizations. Whether it had been deliberately removed or simply lost in the administrative churn of a large institution processing a large amount of material in a short period of time, was not determinable. The initiates learned the war. They did not learn everything the war had contained. This is also what historical distance does. The narrator notes this once and moves on. The Force had not healed the way the Jedi had hoped it would. This was not something discussed openly in the Order, not in the first years after the war, when the temptation to treat the victory as complete was strongest, and not in the decade that followed, when the absence of a visible Sith threat made the more subtle damage easy to overlook. But it was documented, quietly, in the kind of records that Jedi scholars maintained for other Jedi scholars rather than for initiates or the Republic Senate or any external audience. The Telos Holocron, the Ossus Archive, the private journals of masters who had been present during the war and were still present 20 years later, and had been paying attention to what the Force felt like in the intervals between. What the Force felt like in those documents was described in careful language that acknowledged the difficulty of describing something that resisted precise description. One scholar, writing in the 12th year after the war, used a comparison that appeared in several subsequent documents, borrowed, adapted, applied to specific locations. The damage is not dramatic. It does not announce itself. It is present the way an old injury is present in a body that has learned to accommodate it. Not as pain, exactly, but as a slight constraint in certain movements. A tendency to compensate without noticing that compensation is occurring. A sense that something healed not quite correctly, and the healing itself has become part of the structure. Primus Golud's remnant. The Sith tomb worlds, Korriban, Ziost, the others. The places where the dark side had concentrated across thousands of years of deliberate cultivation, where the death and the ambition and the accumulated weight of what the Sith had practiced in those places had left something in the fabric of space that did not dissolve when the practitioners were gone. The unnamed colonies district. That last one was felt by very few. Those sensitive enough to feel it, when they passed through the region, described something small and specific. A gap. A hollow. A place where the Force seemed to have a slightly different texture than the space around it. Not darkness, exactly. Not the aggressive wrongness of a place where the dark side had been actively practiced. Something quieter and more permanent. The kind of mark left not by power but by ordinary human suffering, accumulated in a single location, on a single day, and never acknowledged by either side that had the authority to acknowledge it. The Force held these marks, not dramatically, not in ways that interrupted daily life or required response. Just there, the way scars are there. The way a city that has been rebuilt on the same ground where it was destroyed still carries something of the destruction in its foundations, in the slightly different angle of a rebuilt street, in the foundations exposed by excavation that turn out to be older than the current structure by several layers. The war was over. The wounds were not. Senator Oren Velas of the Koros system served 2 more terms after the war ended. She did not seek a third. She returned to Koros, where the outer installations had been rebuilt, and the evacuation records had been formally closed, and the census figures for the 3rd station, the one that had been partially evacuated, with the specific meaning that phrase carried, had been updated to reflect the final accounting. She worked in Koros for the rest of her life on what she called, in private correspondence, the unfinished business of the war. Not the political business, the human business. The people who had come back to find their homes gone and had rebuilt, or had not been able to rebuild, or had rebuilt something that was not quite the same as what had been there before. The families whose members had been split by the evacuation, some reaching the transports, some not, and who were now navigating the specific complexity of reunion after loss. The communities that had lost their oldest residents, their institutional memory, the people who knew which stories belonged to which places, and were now living on those places without the stories. She wrote about this in letters to her former personal secretary, who had moved to Alderaan and kept the correspondence carefully. She did not write about the War Committee. She did not write about the amnesty proposal. She did not write about the 7th of Memoria. Some things, her letters suggested through their silences, were not available to be written about. Some things could only be carried. She carried them. She died in Koros, in her home, at an age that the records describe as advanced, surrounded by people who knew her well and knew very little about the windowless room. The Sith meditation sphere that had been transported to Coruscant for research analysis was studied for 11 years. The research team's reports are archived in the Republic Science Institute's restricted collection. Access requires specific academic credentials and a written justification reviewed by a committee. The reports describe a thorough and methodical investigation. They describe the sphere's construction, materials, configuration, the engineering principles underlying a vessel that was simultaneously a weapon, an amplification device, and something that the team's force-sensitive consultants identified as a kind of anchor, a fixed point through which a sufficiently powerful practitioner could extend influence across significant distances. They described the resonance that the monitoring systems had detected during transport, the low-frequency emission that had persisted for years after the sphere was placed in the research facility's containment environment. They described the day, in the 7th year of study, when the resonance stopped. No external event corresponded to the cessation. No change in the containment environment. No detectable cause. The resonance had been present. Then it was not. The research team noted this in their report with the precision of scientists recording an observation they cannot explain, which is a different kind of precision from the kind used to record observations they can. The sphere sits in the restricted archive today, inert, silent. Some of the research team members, interviewed in the years following the study's conclusion, said that the silence felt different from the silence of an object that had never made a sound. They struggled to describe the distinction. The closest most of them came was, "It feels like something that has finished, rather than something that never started." The distinction between those two things is the full distance between an ending and an absence. The sphere had ended. Jory Daragon was 47 years old 20 years after the war. She did not look old, exactly. Not in the way that age makes some people look diminished. She looked weathered. The specific quality of someone who has spent 2 decades doing physical work in changing conditions, exposed to the particular wear of a life lived mostly in transit, between places rather than inside them. She still ran cargo. Smaller routes now, and not because the capability was gone. The Starbreaker 12 was as functional as it had ever been. More functional in many respects. Rebuilt across 20 years of steady maintenance and selective upgrade into something that retained its essential character while replacing most of the components that had expressed that character. New hull panels, installed in sections over 4 separate port visits spanning a decade. An upgraded navigation system, replaced in its entirety 8 years after the war when the old system's architecture became incompatible with the standard charts being issued for the newly mapped corridor regions. A completely replaced drive unit, installed 12 years after the war when the original drive's efficiency curve had degraded past the threshold where repair was more expensive than replacement. The ship looked, from the outside, like itself. Inside, almost everything was different. Almost everything. The portside sensor cluster had not been replaced. It had been looked at multiple times by mechanics at various ports over the course of 20 years. The first mechanic who noticed it, a human male at a service station in the colonies, 6 years after the war, had flagged it during a routine inspection and brought it to Jory's attention with the specific manner of someone who expects to be thanked for the observation. She had looked at his report. She had looked at the cluster. She had said, "It's a known fault. I know how to compensate. Leave it in the deferred column." He had looked at her with the expression of a professional whose professional judgment has been politely ignored, and had noted the fault in the inspection record as operator declined repair, and had moved on. The second mechanic who noticed it was a Twi'lek woman at a mid-rim hub 14 years after the war, more experienced than the first. Her observation framed as a question rather than a finding. She had said, "The portside cluster is running 2% off baseline. Has been for a while, from the looks of the maintenance history. You want me to pull it and recalibrate?" Jory had said, "It's a known fault and I know how to work around it." The mechanic had looked at her for a moment with the particular attention of someone who has been in this profession long enough to recognize when a technical explanation is carrying more than technical weight. She had noted the fault as operator declined repair and moved on. Neither mechanic had asked a follow-up question. Jory had not offered more than she said. This was true about several things. 20 years had given Jory Daragon a different relationship with silence than she had carried before the war. Before, silence had been something that happened in the gaps between tasks, the brief quiet of a docking bay at night, the absence of conversation when both she and Gav were focused on separate work. Unremarkable. The natural condition of time, not filled with something else. After, silence had weight. Not all silence, not the ordinary silence of an empty room or a quiet hour, but the specific silence of certain moments, certain locations, certain combinations of circumstances that produced a stillness she had learned to sit inside without requiring it to resolve. She had become, over 20 years, very good at sitting inside stillness. This was not the same as peace. She had made no particular pursuit of peace, and would not have recognized it as a goal worth naming. What she had pursued and achieved was the ability to be inside her own life without the gap where Gav had been becoming something that made ordinary function impossible. The gap was still there. It had been there for 20 years. It was present the way old injuries are present, not as active pain, not as something that interrupted the daily business of living, but as a fact of the structure, a place where the architecture had healed around an absence, and the healing itself had become load-bearing. She had learned to distribute the weight differently. She had not learned to fill the space. The routes she ran now were not the routes she had run before the war. Before, she and Gav had taken whatever was available, the cargo that covered costs, the lane that was accessible, the run that kept the account from going further into deficit. The desperate pragmatism of people with thin margins and no particular preference for destination, as long as the destination paid. After, she was more selective, not because the finances required selectivity in that direction. The administrative settlement from the Republic had cleared the historical debt, and 20 years of careful management had built a position that was modest but stable. She was selective because she had learned, in the years after the war, that some routes passed through places that had a different quality than the space around them, and that passing through those places repeatedly was not something she chose to do more than necessary. Primus Golud's region. She avoided it. Not always possible, but when possible, she chose the longer route, the colony's sector near the 7th of Memoria district. She had passed through it twice in 20 years, both times because the cargo made it unavoidable. Both times she had completed the transit without stopping, filed the route log, and not returned. The Eastern Tion Corridor. She had never gone back to the Eastern Tion Corridor. She had never filed another route application for an uncharted lane. She ran the mapped routes, the established channels, the corridors where the charts were accurate and the emergence points were confirmed, and there was no gravitational variance to compensate for. This was practical. It was also something else. She did not examine the something else too directly. The textile cargo was a routine consignment. Mid-grade fabric from an outer rim manufacturer, a company she had run cargo for 3 times previously. Reliable payer. No complications on any of the prior deliveries. The destination was a distribution hub on a mid-rim station, a facility she had been to 7 times over the course of 20 years, and knew well enough that the approach required no particular preparation. The contract paid adequately. Not well, adequately. Enough to cover the fuel cost for the run and the operating expenses for the period, and contribute something modest to the maintenance reserve that she kept for the Starbreaker 12's ongoing upkeep. She had filed the departure from the loading station on the 4th of Concordia, the Republic calendar's month of agreement, traditionally associated with diplomatic missions and signed contracts. Though she had stopped paying attention to the month names as anything other than administrative notations some years back, the cargo was loaded by the manufacturer's team. The manifest was verified. The Starbreaker 12 lifted off the loading bay and entered the transit lane and made the jump to hyperspace without incident. The corridor held. 3 days in the blue-white, in the non-place between systems, in the specific suspended quality of faster-than-light transit that Gav had described as potential, and she had spent 20 years finding her own relationship with. She had found one. Not his relationship, her own. The corridor was not potential to her. It was interval. The time between departure and arrival, between the place she was coming from and the place she was going, between one portion of the ordinary ongoing work of her life and the next. She had learned to be comfortable in interval. She had spent a long time learning this. The hyperspace transit was uneventful in the way that most things in a well-maintained ship on a known route are uneventful, meaning nothing required response. which is what uneventful actually means when you strip away the connotation that nothing happened. Things happened. The drive ran its standard maintenance cycle on the second day. The navigation system updated its positional calculation against the beacon network on the same schedule it always did. The life support systems cycled through their regular checks. The Starbreaker 12 maintained its course and its speed and its internal environment with the quiet competence of a vessel that had been well cared for over a long period by someone who understood it. Jory slept during the first and third nights of the transit. The second night she sat in the operations bay with a cup of tea, a habit she had developed sometime in the 5th year after the war, without noticing when it started or deciding that it would be a habit, and looked at the hyperspace stream through the forward viewport. The stream was what it always was, blue-white, continuous. The light of compressed space rendered into a visible form that the human eye interpreted as a tunnel when it was technically no such thing. She looked at it. She drank her tea. She thought about the textile cargo in the hold, mid-grade fabric, blue and gray and a dark red that the manufacturer's catalog described as terracotta, but that read closer to something older. Something that reminded her, without being specific about what it reminded her of. She had not looked at the cargo closely when it was loaded. She did not go to the hold to look at it now. She finished the tea. She went back to sleep. The Starbreaker 12 dropped out of hyperspace at the designated emergence point at the start of second watch on the 4th day. The transition was clean. The navigation system's emergence calculation accurate to within standard tolerance. The ship's position at emergence consistent with the plotted coordinates. Real space returned. Stars. The mid-rim station visible at bearing 047. Close enough that the station's running lights were individually distinguishable against the background. The functional amber and white of a commercial hub operating its normal schedule. Nothing remarkable. Nothing that required any particular attention beyond the attention that any approach required. The sensors ran their arrival sweep. This took a moment longer than the theoretical minimum. The portside cluster, running its assessment of the surrounding region, returned its reading 2% behind the other cluster's assessment, the familiar lag. The same lag it had always had. The same 2-beat delay between the portside reading and the starboard side reading that Jory had been compensating for since before the war. She waited for it, the way she always waited for it. Not with impatience, not with anything that could be called emotion. Just the specific attentiveness of someone who knows a particular thing is coming and has oriented their attention toward it without making the orientation into something larger than it is. The lag resolved. The portside cluster completed its sweep. The sensors returned their combined assessment. Clear approach, no navigational hazards, standard commercial traffic in the station's approach lanes. Nothing that required deviation from the plotted vector. Normal readings. Jory noted them. She began the approach calculation. The station was called Meridian Hub 7. It had been called this for longer than Jory had been alive. One of those commercial installations whose name had long since ceased to carry any meaning beyond designation, any more than a street number carries meaning beyond address. She had first come here 19 years ago, a year after the war ended, with a cargo of medical supplies for a distribution company that had since been acquired by a larger consortium and no longer operated under the name she had first contracted with. The hub itself had changed in 19 years, expanded twice. The second expansion still visible in the slightly different color of the newer section's hull plating. The original sections weathered to a particular shade of gray by 19 additional years of exposure. The newer sections a shade brighter that would eventually match. Everything eventually matches, given enough time. The docking registry showed Bay 14 available on her registration class. She filed for Bay 14. The confirmation came back in the standard window. The Starbreaker 12 oriented toward the approach lane. The approach to Meridian Hub 7 at commercial transit speed took 40 minutes from the emergence point. 40 minutes of gradual deceleration, of the station growing from a point of light to a visible structure to a specific place with specific geometry, of the approach lane's marker beacons appearing and being followed in the sequence that all approach lanes required. Jory ran the approach on manual. She had run approaches on manual for 20 years. Not because the navigation system was incapable of handling it automatically. The upgraded system was significantly more capable than the original and perfectly adequate for routine approaches to well-charted stations. She ran them manually because she liked the work. Because the specific attention required to bring a ship in correctly, the continuous small adjustments, the reading of the instruments and the translation of those readings into control inputs, the particular conversation between a pilot and a ship in the process of arriving somewhere, was work she knew how to do and found satisfaction in doing. Competence in small things. She had built her life on this after the war, not on the large things. The large things had happened to her rather than being built. She had been inside the great hyperspace war the way you are inside weather, not directing it, not shaping it, trying to navigate it correctly and survive to the other side. What she had built in the 20 years since was the daily competence of someone who knows their work and does it well, and finds in that doing something that is not happiness exactly, but is its own sufficient thing. The station grew in the viewport. Bay 14's approach marker appeared on the navigation display. Jory brought the Starbreaker 12 in along the marked vector, making the adjustments the approach required. Watching the instruments, and watching the station, and watching the space between the two. The Starbreaker 12 entered the station's shadow at the start of the final approach segment. The shadow of a large structure in space is not dark the way planetary shadow is dark. There is no atmosphere to scatter the light. No gradient from illuminated to dim to dark. The shadow is immediate. One moment the ship is in direct starlight. The next moment the station is between the ship and the star, and the light is gone, and what replaces it is the station's own lighting, the amber and white running lights, the approach lane markers, the illuminated bay entrance numbers visible from the approach vector. The Starbreaker 12's running lights came on automatically when the shadow hit the hull sensors. This was standard. The ship's systems were configured to activate running lights when ambient light dropped below the operational threshold. A setting so routine that she had never thought of it as a setting, only as something the ship did. The lights came on. Small, warm orange-white against the dark of the station's shadow. Ahead, Bay 14's entrance was lit and open and waiting with the specific patience of a structure that has no relationship with time and will be exactly as waiting in an hour as it is now. The Starbreaker 12 moved toward it. 20 years. The number sits in the mind differently at different moments. In administrative terms, 20 years is a unit of time, the interval between two dates, measurable, finite, no different in kind from 1 year or 100. In the terms available to a person who has been living inside those 20 years, who has made thousands of small decisions within them, who has run hundreds of routes and filed hundreds of manifests and drunk thousands of cups of tea in the operations bay of a ship rebuilt almost entirely from new components. 20 years is not a unit. It is an accumulation, a weight that has no clean edges and cannot be separated into its component parts without losing the thing that makes it what it is. Jory did not think about 20 years in either of these ways. While bringing the Starbreaker 12 into Bay 14, she thought about the approach vector. She thought about the bay entrance dimensions relative to the ship's beam. She thought about the deceleration rate and the thrust required to achieve it. She was doing her work. Bay 14 was a standard commercial bay, large enough for the Starbreaker 12, with room for the cargo handling equipment to operate around it, lit by the overhead fixtures that all bays of this class used. Smelling of the particular combination of machine oil and recycled atmosphere, and the residue of previous cargoes that all commercial bays smell of, regardless of where they are located or who built them. The smell of commerce. The smell of cargo moved by people doing work for adequate pay in adequate conditions, without drama or significance. The Starbreaker 12 settled onto the bay floor with the small hydraulic sound of the landing struts absorbing the ship's weight. Drive down. Systems to standby. The arrival checklist ran in the background, the automatic sequence that the ship performed on landing, confirming each system's post-transit status, flagging anything that needed attention before the next departure. The port-side sensor cluster registered in the checklist as known fault, 2% off baseline, operator compensated. This notation had been in the checklist for 20 years. It would remain there. Jory sat at the operations terminal after the checklist completed. She did not immediately open the cargo offload communication to the distribution hub's receiving team. She sat for a moment. This was also a habit, though she had never named it as one. After arrival, before the next obligation, a moment of sitting in the completed thing before moving into what came after it. The bay was quiet around the ship. Through the viewport, the operations bay's small forward viewport angled slightly downward, offering a view of the bay floor and the bay entrance, and the thin slice of the station corridor visible beyond it. She could see the ordinary movement of a commercial facility conducting its regular business. A cargo handling unit moving through the corridor. A pair of workers in station coveralls, heading somewhere with the purposeful, unhurried pace of people who have a destination and are going to reach it without difficulty. The station's ambient sound, the ventilation, the distant machinery of a large installation doing what large installations do, present at a level low enough to be almost silence and loud enough to prevent actual silence. Ordinary. She sat in it, 20 years ago, standing in Bay 7 on Coruscant with the Starbreaker 12 looking the same in front of her and everything else irrevocably different. She had not been able to see 20 years ahead. Nobody can. But she had been able to feel the shape of what was available, the routes still to be run, the work still to be done, the specific ongoing daily business of a life that was hers to continue whether or not the continuing felt, in that moment, like something she had chosen. She had started the engines. She had made the choice to continue making choices. 20 years of choices later, she was here. Bay 14 of Meridian Hub 7, with a cargo of mid-grade textile goods in the hold, and a distribution team that would be expecting her offload communication, and a next departure that she had already roughly scheduled in her head, and a maintenance reserve adequate for the next service interval. Here, the word was simple, and the reality it described was simple, and the simplicity was not a diminishment. A difficult life, well managed, had brought her to an ordinary arrival at an ordinary bay, with the instruments reading normal and the work continuing. This was not nothing. This had never been nothing. She opened the offload communication. The distribution team confirmed receipt of her arrival notification and provided the handling bay assignment and the expected processing timeline. Standard. Efficient. The ordinary language of commercial logistics, doing what commercial logistics does. She acknowledged. She began the post-arrival documentation, the cargo manifest confirmation, the transit log entry, the fuel consumption record for the run. Her hands moved through the familiar tasks. The operations bay was warm and quiet and well lit. The portside sensor cluster sat in its housing on the ship's outer hull, exactly where it had always been, running its standby monitoring function at 2% off baseline exactly as it had always run it. The record does not end with a large thing. This is deliberate. The Great Hyperspace War was a large thing. The death of a civilization, the survival of another, the wounds left in the Force and in the census records and in the archives and in the people who had been inside it. These were large things, and they have been described across the preceding chapters with whatever accuracy was available to the materials. But the record ends here, in Bay 14, with the ordinary sounds of a ship at standby and a station conducting its business and a woman doing the documentation for a cargo run that paid adequately and required no particular heroism and contributed to nothing larger than the specific ongoing work of keeping herself and her ship operational. The portside sensor cluster lagged on the arrival sweep, as it always had. She had waited for it, as she always did. The lag resolved. The sensors returned normal readings. She knew where she was. She always knew where she was. The docking bay doors were already closed behind her, sealed against the station's exterior. The ordinary sound of them settling into their locked position already past and already forgotten in the way that completed things are forgotten. Not lost, just no longer requiring attention. The bay was quiet. The ship was still. The running lights, which had come on automatically in the station's shadow, were on standby now, the ship's systems registering the bay's internal lighting as sufficient and dimming the exterior lights accordingly. Small lights, no longer needed. The darkness outside the bay was large. The work inside the bay was small and specific and continuing. The record ends here, not because the story ends, but because the story does not end, and what does not end cannot be concluded, only observed for a while and then set down. She was here. She knew where she was. She had always known where she was. The work continued.